My husband stood over my paralyzed body, casually swirling his martini, while I lay motionless at the bottom of our marble staircase. "Walk it off. Stop being a baby," he scoffed loudly. His entitled sister complained about her ruined birthday cake, and his brother-in-law nudged my lifeless arm with his shoe. They thought they had finally silenced the annoying observant auditor of the family forever. They had no idea I was silently memorizing every single detail to destroy their lives. My name is Nora, 33 years old, and a senior forensic auditor for a major healthcare network in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in a toxic family, but secretly held all the cards. The betrayal I experienced that night changed everything. I stared up at the vaulted ceiling of our suburban home, the crystal chandelier blurring above me. The brutal physical impact of falling down 12 solid marble steps had completely knocked the wind out of me, but that was not why I was frozen. A terrifying icy numbness was rapidly spreading from my lower spine down to my toes. I spent my demanding days relentlessly tracking millions of dollars in hidden corporate assets and fraudulent accounts. Yet in this terrifying moment, I could not even command my own fingers to twitch. The loud thumping bass from the party music upstairs seemed to mock the deafening silence in my own head. Bradley, my 35-year-old husband, stood 3 steps from the bottom. He did not drop his expensive crystal glass. He did not rush to my side in a panic to check my pulse. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt, looking down at me with pure annoyance. His perfectly styled hair did not even move. "Get up, Nora," he snapped, his voice echoing in the grand foyer. "You are embarrassing yourself. Walk it off and stop being a baby." Beside him, his 31-year-old sister Sienna let out a loud theatrical sigh. She smoothed down her tight sequined dress and glared at me. "Seriously, Nora, you just had to make a scene right before we cut my cake. It is my birthday. Can you not make everything about yourself for just one single night?" I tried to open my mouth. I wanted to scream that I could not feel my legs, but my vocal cords felt like they were injected with liquid cement. I could only blink, my chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Trey stepped into my line of sight. He was Sienna's husband, a 34-year-old African-American luxury real estate broker who made a living selling homes he could barely afford to people he secretly despised. He crouched down slightly, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and nudged my left shoulder with the tip of his polished leather loafer. "Come on, Nora." Trey chuckled, his deep voice dripping with pure condescension. "The audit is over. You do not have to fake a workplace injury here. Get up. You are ruining the aesthetic of Sienna's party." My mind was racing with absolute clarity even as my body failed me. As a forensic auditor, I was trained to look for discrepancies and anomalies in the data. The anomaly here was not the fall itself. It was the sharp, sudden pinch I had felt in my lower back right before I tumbled down the stairs. It was not a clumsy slip on my part. Someone had bumped into me in the crowded second-floor hallway, and a second later my legs had simply folded underneath me like cut strings. A guest muttered from the crowd gathering in the foyer. It was Tom, one of the primary wealthy investors for Bradley's high-end, heavily leveraged physical therapy clinic. "Bradley, she is actually not moving. I am calling 911. "No need for that," Tom Bradley quickly interjected. His tone suddenly shifted from annoyed to falsely reassuring. He finally set his martini glass down on the banister and jogged down the remaining 3 steps. He crouched beside me, his fingers digging painfully into my arm. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of gin. "I own a physical therapy clinic, remember? I will take her to my facility. She just bruised her tailbone. She is being dramatic. I already pressed call Bradley. They are on their way," Tom replied firmly, stepping back. A flash of genuine panic crossed Bradley's face. It was so fast that anyone else would have missed it. But I did not. I saw his sharp jaw clench tightly together. I saw him shoot a desperate, wide-eyed look at Trey. Trey lost his arrogant smirk, instantly realizing the severe implications. He subtly nodded at Bradley and slipped his hands into his pockets. I was trapped inside my own body, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family, realizing with chilling certainty that one of them had just tried to kill me. The distant wail of a police siren began to pierce the quiet suburban night air. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. The deadly game was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous and ultimate audit of my deceitful husband had only just begun. I would expose everything. The wail of the sirens grew deafening until red and white lights flashed violently through the frosted glass of our front door. The heavy oak panels burst open and 2 paramedics rushed into the foyer, carrying a rigid backboard and a trauma kit. The wealthy suburbanites surrounding me instantly parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in hushed, nervous tones. A female paramedic dropped to her knees beside my motionless body. She shined a blinding penlight directly into my eyes. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she asked urgently. I blinked twice, throwing all my energy into that single tiny movement. "Okay." She is responsive, but completely nonverbal. The paramedic told her partner, who was rapidly checking my pulse. She ran her gloved hands expertly down my legs. "I am going to pinch your calf now. Blink twice if you feel any pain." She pinched hard. I stared blankly at the ceiling. I felt absolutely nothing. The paramedic frowned deeply, her professional demeanor shifting into high gear. She gently rolled me onto my side to check my spine for trauma. As her fingers brushed against my lower back, she stopped dead. "What on earth?" she whispered. She looked up, her sharp eyes locking directly onto Bradley, who was hovering uncomfortably close. "Did she fall on anything sharp? A needle? A pin?" "No, just the marble stairs," Bradley answered quickly. His voice cracked slightly, an octave higher than his usual confident tone. "Like I said, I am a medical professional. I can take over her care right now at my private clinic." "Back away from my patient immediately," the paramedic snapped. Her voice sliced through the heavy tension in the room like a scalpel. She grabbed the radio on her shoulder, pressing the transmission button. "Dispatch, we have a code red at this location. I need police backup immediately. I repeat, send law enforcement. This is not a standard fall. I am looking at a fresh puncture wound directly over the L4 vertebra. The patient is exhibiting textbook symptoms of acute chemically induced paralysis." The paramedic's words hit the room like a shockwave. Code red, police backup, chemically induced paralysis. The party guests began stepping away from Bradley, as if he were suddenly highly contagious. I lay strapped to the rigid backboard, staring up at the paramedic, who was now furiously securing an oxygen mask over my face. For the first time all evening, I felt a tiny, sharp spark of hope. I could not move, but the truth was beginning to move for me. "Wait! Chemically induced." "What are you even talking about?" Sienna shrieked. Her voice was shrill and trembling as she pushed her way to the front of the crowd. "She just fell. She probably drank too much of my imported champagne and tripped in her cheap heels. You are ruining my birthday with this police nonsense, ma'am. Step back before I have you physically removed for interfering with emergency medical personnel," the paramedic warned coldly. She did not even glance up as she secured the heavy straps tightly across my chest. She looked down at me, her eyes softening just a fraction. "Hang in there, honey. We are getting you out of this house." Trey moved smoothly, stepping between the angry paramedic and Bradley. He held his hands up in a gesture of false peace. "Let us all just calm down," Trey said. He utilized the same deep, persuasive baritone he used to close multi-million-dollar real estate deals. "My brother-in-law is simply distressed about his injured wife. We will follow you to the hospital in our own vehicles. There is absolutely no need for law enforcement to disrupt a private family gathering." "Law enforcement is already pulling into the driveway, sir," the paramedic replied bluntly. She nodded toward the flashing blue lights now joining the red ones outside. 2 armed police officers burst into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The paramedic gave them a rapid-fire medical briefing pointing directly to the hidden puncture mark on my back. The officers immediately stepped forward and separated Bradley from the rest of the group. As the paramedics wheeled my stretcher out the front door and into the cool Chicago night air, I caught one last glimpse of my deceitful husband. Bradley was aggressively pointing his finger at an officer, his face flushed bright red with rage. He was shouting something about his constitutional rights and his medical license. He looked absolutely desperate. And as his auditor, I knew Bradley only ever got desperate when he was about to lose total control. The ambulance ride was a chaotic blur of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic, terrifying beeping of the heart monitor. When we arrived at the emergency room, I was rushed straight into the trauma bay. A team of doctors swarmed me, cutting away my ruined dress and connecting me to a dozen different machines. My mind remained perfectly sharp, acting as a silent, invisible recorder. I mentally logged everything: the exact time on the wall clock, the name of the attending physician, and the precise dosage of the fluids they administered. I was preparing my ultimate case file. 30 minutes after entering the trauma bay, the medical team carefully transferred my rigid body onto the sliding table of the MRI machine. The harsh fluorescent overhead lights were quickly replaced by the narrow claustrophobic tunnel of the medical scanner. As the massive machine swallowed me whole, the loud, rhythmic thudding of the magnetic coils began to fire. It sounded like a heavy metallic drumbeat echoing directly inside my skull. I was completely alone in the cold metal tube, unable to move a single muscle, but my analytical brain was working at maximum capacity. I meticulously reviewed every single interaction from the birthday party. The exact way Bradley had aggressively insisted on standing right behind me near the top of the marble staircase. The brief, sharp, stinging pressure I felt just below my waistline while the crowd was distracted by the cake. The highly suspicious fact that he was so quick to dismiss my total paralysis as a simple bruised tailbone. He had planned this horrific event perfectly. When the loud banging of the MRI finally stopped, the automatic table slowly slid out of the machine. The radiology technician did not look me in the eye. He seemed deeply disturbed by whatever he had just seen on his high-definition monitor. He quickly wheeled me back into a private, highly secure recovery room, located at the far end of the emergency department. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing me in agonizing silence for what felt like hours. Finally, the brass handle turned. Dr. Aris, the senior attending physician who had treated me in the trauma bay, walked into the room. His expression was incredibly grim and tightly drawn. He was holding a digital tablet displaying my scan results. Right behind him stepped a tall, imposing man wearing a dark trench coat and a silver badge clipped securely to his leather belt. This was clearly not a standard hospital security guard. This was a homicide detective. Dr. Aris walked straight to the side of my bed and shined his bright penlight into my eyes one more time to check my pupillary response. "Nora, I know you are entirely conscious and can hear every single word I am saying," he began gently. His voice was calm but laced with intense professional concern. "You are currently experiencing total flaccid paralysis in your lower extremities, along with temporary vocal cord paralysis. But the MRI scan confirmed exactly what the paramedics suspected at your house. You did not sustain any severe spinal fractures or broken bones from your violent fall down the stairs. The physical trauma to your back is purely superficial." He paused for a heavy moment, tapping the glass screen of his tablet to pull up a high-resolution image of my lower spine. He turned the bright screen so I could clearly see the glowing white cluster of pixels near my L4 vertebra. Instead of structural bone damage, we found a highly concentrated pool of a synthetic neurotoxin injected directly into your epidural space. It is an incredibly rare and incredibly potent chemical nerve block. It is absolutely not something you can just buy on the street or steal from a standard pharmacy. It requires highly specialized medical clearance to obtain and extreme anatomical precision to inject. Someone knew exactly where to place the needle to instantly disable your motor functions without immediately stopping your heart. The detective stepped forward, pulling a small leather notebook from his deep coat pocket. He looked down at me with sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing. "Someone did not just accidentally bump into you, Nora," the detective stated firmly. His deep, commanding voice filled the quiet hospital room, bringing a chilling, absolute reality to the terrifying situation. "Someone with advanced medical knowledge deliberately paralyzed you before you went down those stairs. We are officially treating this incident as a premeditated, attempted homicide. We already have uniformed officers securing your home as an active crime scene." A cold, terrifying realization washed over me, sharper than the needle that had pierced my spine. Bradley was not just a highly successful physical therapist running a high-end suburban clinic. The charming, arrogant man I married had spent the first 4 years of his medical career training extensively as an anesthesiologist. He had eventually washed out of the demanding surgical residency program due to what he claimed were unfair administrative disputes. But he retained all the specialized medical knowledge. He knew exactly how to calculate the precise correct dosage for my body weight. He knew exactly how to administer a deep spinal nerve block in a fraction of a second. But much more importantly, Bradley had a desperate ticking time bomb of a motive. He knew exactly what I had discovered that very morning. As a senior forensic auditor, I trusted raw numbers far more than I trusted people. I had run a routine quarterly audit on our joint investment accounts and his clinic operating funds. That was when I found the massive, glaring black hole hiding in the digital ledgers. $4 million had systematically vanished through a complex web of offshore shell companies. Bradley had secretly drained my generational trust fund to keep his fraudulent business empire afloat, and I was the only person alive who possessed the financial blueprints to tear it all down. He did not paralyze me out of sudden blind rage. This was a calculated, cold-blooded corporate liquidation, and I was the primary asset he needed to permanently eliminate. The hospital room door slammed open, hitting the wall with a loud thud that echoed sharply in the sterile space. Bradley strode into the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. He was no longer playing the panicked, concerned husband he had portrayed on our staircase. He was flanked by a slick, sharp-suited man carrying a thick leather briefcase. I immediately recognized him as Richard, the ruthless corporate defense attorney Bradley kept on retainer to handle his clinic's endless malpractice complaints. The homicide detective immediately stepped in front of my bed, raising his hand to physically halt their advance. "You cannot be in here, sir," the detective stated firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "This is an active crime scene investigation, and the patient is in critical medical condition. You need to step outside right now." Bradley scoffed loudly, waving a sheaf of crisp legal documents in the air. "I am her husband," he countered, his voice booming with manufactured outrage designed to intimidate the hospital staff. "And I have full medical power of attorney. My wife has suffered a traumatic physical incident, and she is being held here against my explicit wishes. I am transferring her to my private rehabilitation clinic immediately for specialized care. I already have a private transport ambulance waiting at the loading dock. Your wife has been poisoned with a medical-grade neurotoxin." The detective shot back, his jaw tight and his hand resting casually near his duty belt. "She is not going anywhere with you, Dr. Bradley. In fact, I have some very serious questions about your exact whereabouts and your actions during the birthday party tonight." Richard, the high-priced attorney, stepped smoothly in front of Bradley, flashing a predatory, practiced smile. "Detective, my client is a highly respected healthcare provider in this city. Any baseless allegations that he harmed his own wife are entirely defamatory and legally actionable. Furthermore, my client's wife is currently completely incapacitated. According to these legally binding documents, Bradley is in charge of her medical care and her financial estate until she recovers. If you restrict his legal access or attempt to unlawfully interrogate an unconscious trauma victim without representation, I will file an emergency injunction against this hospital and your entire department by sunrise." I will have your badge for violating her civil rights. I watched Bradley's face closely over the detective's broad shoulder. He looked perfectly composed. He played the role of the frustrated, grieving spouse to absolute perfection. But beneath that polished veneer, I saw the absolute arrogance radiating from his pores. He genuinely believed he had won the game. He believed that by paralyzing me, he had effectively muted the only forensic auditor who could expose his massive financial crimes. At the same time, he was using this manufactured medical crisis to gain total legal control over my $4 million trust fund through his power of attorney. He was trying to execute a hostile takeover of my very life. His ultimate plan was to lock me away in his private clinic, where I would slowly wither away, heavily medicated and completely isolated, while he drained my accounts dry. As the men argued fiercely at the foot of my bed, my eyes drifted upward. Mounted securely in the upper right corner of the hospital room was a small black glass dome. It was a high-definition security camera. I knew hospital administrative protocols intimately because I had personally audited this exact medical network's security expenditure budget last quarter. That camera fed directly to a secure encrypted server recording both audio and high-resolution video 24 hours a day. Bradley thought he was so incredibly clever. He assumed my temporary paralysis meant I was blind, deaf, and helpless to the world. He did not realize that I was fully conscious behind my frozen exterior. I kept my eyes locked onto that black glass dome. I was a living, breathing recording device, and the camera above was my silent technological witness. I was memorizing every single legal threat Richard made. I was analyzing every micro-expression on Bradley's smug face. Dr. Aris stepped forward, crossing his arms firmly. As the attending physician, I am officially stating that Nora is not medically stable for transport, he declared. Releasing her into your custody would violate federal patient safety laws. She stays right here under police guard. Bradley's arrogant smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened in pure frustration. He glared down at me, his cold eyes burning with a silent, deadly threat. We will let the legal system handle this tomorrow morning, Richard advised, smoothly placing a firm, restraining hand on Bradley's shoulder. Let us go. The probate judge will gladly grant us full custody by noon. Before turning away, Bradley leaned in slightly close enough for me to smell his expensive gin-laced breath. He whispered softly, meant only for my ears. You should have minded your own business, Nora. I am taking everything. As they walked out of the room and the heavy door clicked shut behind them, the detective let out a long, exhausted breath. He looked down at me, immediately noticing my fixed, intense gaze. He followed my line of sight straight to the security camera, then looked back down at my eyes. I focused all of my remaining willpower and blinked twice in rapid succession. The detective gave a slow, understanding nod. He knew I was fully awake inside my silent prison, and he knew I was preparing for war. The detective gave me a slow, understanding nod, a silent pact formed between us without a single word spoken. He turned to the uniformed police officer stationed at my door, ordering him to let absolutely no one inside under any circumstances. The detective then stepped down the hall to secure his search warrants. However, as the heavy hospital door swung shut, the latch did not fully catch. It remained open just a fraction of an inch, leaving a thin sliver of the brightly lit corridor visible from my bed. The rhythmic mechanical beeping of my heart monitor was the only sound in my room, but my hearing had become hypersensitive to compensate for my paralyzed limbs. That is when I heard the hushed, frantic voices echoing from the hallway just outside my door. Bradley had not left the hospital premises with his lawyer. He had stayed behind to deal with the immediate fallout from Trey. Trey sounded absolutely furious. His usually smooth, persuasive voice was strained and cracking with severe panic. "This is an absolute disaster," Bradley Trey hissed, pacing back and forth in front of the narrow crack in my door. His expensive leather shoes squeaked sharply against the linoleum. "If she does not sign the offshore wire transfer authorization by tomorrow afternoon, My Southside luxury condo development goes into immediate default. I have millions of dollars tied up in that construction project. Millions of dollars of dirty money that belongs to private lenders you absolutely do not want to cross. They do not send collection letters, Bradley. They send men with baseball bats. Keep your voice down, Bradley snapped back. The raw panic in his own tone was entirely palpable. I handled the situation, did I not? She cannot talk. She cannot walk. She cannot sign anything, but she also cannot testify to the police. The authorities have absolutely no concrete proof it was me who injected her. It is just flimsy circumstantial evidence right now. The official toxicology report will take days to process through the state crime lab. Circumstantial? Trey scoffed loudly, his patience evaporating entirely. The homicide detective practically accused you of attempted murder right to your arrogant face. If the police audit your physical therapy clinic and find the massive accounting discrepancies, if they trace the fraudulent shell companies back to my real estate firm, we are both going to federal prison for a very long time. You promised me you had this under complete control when you found out she audited the joint accounts this morning. I do have it under control. Bradley growled, his voice trembling violently with a toxic mixture of fear and blind rage. Richard is drafting the emergency legal paperwork right now. First thing tomorrow morning, as soon as the doors open, we are going directly before Judge Harrison at the county probate court. We are filing for an emergency conservatorship. There was a brief, stunned pause in the hallway before Trey responded. His tone shifted from panicked to dangerously calculating. A conservatorship. Like they do for elderly patients with severe dementia. Exactly. Bradley confirmed, sounding sickeningly smug and proud of his own twisted brilliance. Because of the neurotoxin side effects on her nervous system, we will successfully argue to the judge that she has suffered severe cognitive decline and psychological trauma from the fall. We will claim she is entirely incapable of managing her own complex financial affairs. As her legal husband and a licensed medical professional, the judge will grant me full medical and financial power of attorney without question. The probate courts rubber stamp these emergency petitions every single day when a spouse is unexpectedly hospitalized. Once I possess the court-ordered conservatorship, I gain immediate unrestricted access to her $4 million generational trust fund. I can legally sign the wire transfer for your real estate project myself. I will control every single penny she has in her name. And what about the police investigation? Trey asked, clearly intrigued but still highly skeptical of the flawless plan. What happens when she eventually recovers her motor functions and talks to the detective? Once I am her legally appointed guardian, I can easily refuse to let the police interview her, Bradley replied smoothly, his sinister confidence returning in full force. I can legally transfer her to a private, highly secure facility completely out of state. I know doctors who will keep her heavily sedated for her own comfort. She will disappear into the medical system and her little forensic audit will die with her. We will pay off your dangerous lenders by noon tomorrow and my clinic will absorb the rest of the trust fund to cover the missing operating capital. We are going to be perfectly fine. I lay silently in my hospital bed listening to them casually and callously plan the total theft of my entire life. They genuinely thought I was a helpless pawn they could simply remove from the board to save their failing financial schemes. They were operating under the arrogant assumption that my physical paralysis made me completely powerless. They had no idea that I had already mentally calculated the exact time the downtown courthouse opened. I had roughly 8 hours to initiate a catastrophic financial lockdown before Bradley could stand before that judge. The corporate audit was far from over. It was about to become an active demolition. The hours of the night dragged on like thick, heavy syrup. The digital clock on the hospital wall glowed with harsh red numbers silently ticking away the rapidly shrinking duration of my financial independence. 2 in the morning, 3:15, 4:40. Every single time the neon numbers changed, I pictured Bradley in his plush home office across town. I imagined him sipping premium espresso, meticulously organizing the forged medical documents Richard had hurriedly drafted. I knew exactly how the American probate court system functioned. I had audited enough massive estates to understand the terrifying speed of an emergency petition. County judges were perpetually overworked and their daily dockets were constantly overflowing with cases. If a well-dressed licensed medical professional like my husband stood before Judge Harrison at 9 in the morning with a thick stack of signed affidavits claiming his wife had suffered a catastrophic neurological event, the conservatorship would be granted in less than 10 minutes. There would be no extensive cross-examination, no waiting period. Once that heavy wooden gavel hit the sounding block, my signature would instantly become legally worthless. Bradley would have the absolute legal authority to drain my $4 million trust fund dry before lunchtime. I had to beat him to the courthouse doors without ever leaving this hospital bed. But a brilliant financial defense strategy means absolutely nothing if you cannot physically execute it. I lay completely flat on my back, trapped inside a heavy suit of invisible armor. Dr. Aris had clearly stated that my upper motor functions might slowly return as my immune system processed and filtered out the dangerous neurotoxin. Might was not a word an auditor ever liked to rely on. I needed absolute, undeniable certainty. I closed my eyes and focused all of my conscious energy on my right arm. I aggressively ignored the steady, annoying beeping of the heart monitors and the distant, muffled chatter from the hallway. I visualized the complex neural pathways traveling from my brain down my damaged spinal cord and out to my fingertips. I sent a single, desperate, commanding signal to my right index finger. Move. Nothing happened. My hand remained a useless, heavy lump of flesh, resting limply on the sterile white hospital blanket. Panic flared incredibly hot in my chest, threatening to completely overwhelm my cold logic. I forced myself to breathe evenly through my nose. I had to approach this physical barrier exactly like a complex forensic audit. If the primary financial route is blocked by a firewall, you find a secondary access point. I shifted my intense focus from the entire finger to just the smallest, most basic muscle near the knuckle joint. I imagined sending an electrical spark down a frayed copper wire. I pushed with every single ounce of mental willpower I possessed. My brain literally felt like it was overheating from the sheer physical exertion of trying to move a single millimeter of bone and tissue. The digital wall clock clicked to 5:15 in the morning. The sky outside the small hospital window was beginning to turn a bruised, pale gray. My time was evaporating into thin air. I pushed my concentration again, bearing down with an invisible, agonizing force. And then I finally felt it. A tiny, microscopic flutter under my skin. It was so incredibly faint I almost thought I had just imagined it. But then the actual tip of my index finger twitched, scraping ever so slightly against the rough fabric of the blanket. It was the physical equivalent of a single drop of water in a vast dry desert, but it was enough. The damaged neural pathway was slowly, stubbornly opening back up. I did not stop. I could not afford to rest for even a second. I sent the brain command again and again, establishing a rhythmic pulse of sheer willpower. Twitch, rest, twitch, rest. Slowly, painfully, the movement grew undeniably stronger. By 6 in the morning, my entire index finger could bend at the middle joint. By 6:30, I could successfully tap my finger heavily against the mattress with enough force to create a dull, audible thud. My forearm muscles burned with a fiery, exhausting ache, but it was the most glorious pain I had ever experienced in my entire life. It meant the paralytic drug was failing. It meant I was still securely in the fight. Now I finally had a physical mechanism to communicate, but I desperately needed the right audience. I could not just wildly signal the armed police officer standing guard outside my door. I needed someone who understood complex hospital administrative protocols. I needed someone with unrestricted access to an encrypted smartphone. And most importantly, I needed someone who owed me a massive favor. I knew the hospital staff shift change occurred exactly at 7 in the morning. I needed the morning rotation to bring me the perfect ally. I kept my eyes fixed intensely on the heavy wooden door, rhythmically tapping my right index finger against the mattress to keep the recovering muscles warm and active. The digital clock hit 6:50. Bradley would be getting into his luxury SUV right about now. He thought he was driving straight toward his ultimate financial salvation. He had no idea he was actually driving into a meticulously planned demolition site. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room pushed open exactly as the digital clock flashed 7 in the morning. A nurse dressed in crisp navy blue scrubs stepped quietly inside carrying a fresh IV bag and a digital tablet. Her name tag read Mai. She was a highly seasoned registered nurse with sharp observant eyes and a strict no-nonsense professional demeanor. I recognized her instantly. 3 years ago, my firm was hired to conduct a massive internal audit of this exact hospital network following a severe discrepancy in their pharmaceutical billing department. A corrupt senior administrator had been systematically stealing highly regulated narcotics and actively framing the minority nursing staff to cover his tracks. Mai was his primary target. She had been weeks away from losing her nursing license and facing federal criminal charges. My relentless forensic audit successfully uncovered the hidden offshore accounts where the administrator was funneling his dirty money, completely clearing Mai of all false accusations. I had saved her career and her life. She had never forgotten it. Mai approached the side of my bed, her eyes fixed on the medical chart in her hands. She checked the fluid levels, adjusted the heart monitor, and finally looked down at my face. For a brief second, her expression remained professionally blank. Then her dark eyes widened in sudden profound recognition. She gasped softly, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. She looked rapidly toward the hallway. The uniformed police officer was stationed directly outside the door, his back turned to the room, talking quietly into his shoulder radio. Mai stepped carefully over to the door and gently pushed it until the heavy latch clicked firmly shut, plunging the room into private silence. She rushed back to my bedside, leaning down so close I could smell the faint scent of antibacterial soap on her skin. "Nora," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling with intense emotion. "My God, it is really you." I heard the terrible rumors flying around the nurses' station this morning. The staff was talking about the wealthy doctor whose wife fell down the stairs and suffered severe brain damage. They said he was aggressively demanding an immediate hospital transfer and rushing to the county courthouse to file an emergency medical conservatorship. I had no idea the patient was you. This was the absolute critical moment. I focused every single ounce of my remaining strength on my right hand. I lifted my index finger and brought it down hard against the mattress. A dull, distinct thud echoed in the quiet room. Mai froze. "Mai." She stared intensely at my hand, then looked up directly into my eyes. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact, pouring all my desperation and resolve into that single look. "Are you conscious?" Mai asked, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "Can you understand what I am saying right now?" I blinked twice in rapid succession. Then I tapped my finger against the mattress again. One solid tap. A fierce, determined light instantly ignited in Mai's eyes. The panicked nurse vanished, replaced entirely by the sharp, efficient professional I had helped save 3 years ago. She understood exactly what was happening. She knew the harsh medical reality of my paralyzed condition, and she knew the terrifying legal implications of Bradley standing before a judge at this very moment. "He is trying to steal everything from you while you are trapped inside your own body," Mai stated bluntly, her jaw setting into a hard line. "He is telling the hospital administrators you are a complete vegetable. He wants them to declare you legally incompetent so he can take control. We have less than 2 hours before the probate courts open, and he gets a judge to sign away your entire life." I blinked twice. "Yes." She grasped the severe urgency of the timeline perfectly. "You need to stop him." Mai continued, her mind racing as she quickly pulled her personal smartphone from the deep pocket of her scrubs. "But you cannot speak to the homicide detective outside, and you cannot physically sign a legal counter-injunction to block the court order. We need to hit him where it actually hurts. We need to lock down your money before he gets that piece of paper." I blinked twice again, feeling a massive surge of gratitude. Mai was brilliant. She quickly held her bright smartphone screen directly above my face, hovering it just inches from my nose. You cannot type, but I know you constantly use facial recognition for your high-security banking applications. Mai whispered, angling the phone carefully so it aligned with my features. I will hold the device and navigate the screens. You guide me through the security interface with your eyes and blinks. We are going to build a financial wall your husband cannot climb. The bright screen illuminated my face. I stared directly into the front-facing camera of her phone. A small green padlock icon flashed on the screen, followed instantly by the soft chime of a successful biometric scan. The heavy digital vault doors of my primary financial dashboard swung wide open, revealing the massive numbers of my trust fund and our joint accounts. It was time to permanently freeze Bradley out of the empire he was trying to steal. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim hospital room. The facial recognition software confirmed my identity in a fraction of a second, bypassing the complex biometric firewalls I had personally established. The heavy digital vault doors of my primary wealth management portal swung open on Mai's smartphone. The massive figures glared back at us. My $4 million generational trust fund, the diversified stock portfolios, and the various joint checking accounts I foolishly shared with Bradley were all fully accessible. It was time to permanently freeze my treacherous husband out of the empire he was actively trying to steal. Mai held her hands incredibly steady, though her breathing was shallow with nervous anticipation. She looked at me, waiting for directions. I shifted my intense gaze to the bottom right corner of the glowing screen directly at the settings gear icon. I tapped my right index finger heavily against the mattress one time. Mai immediately tapped the gear. The security menu expanded. I looked at the shield icon representing advanced asset protection. Another single tap of my finger. Mai followed my silent command, flawlessly acting as the physical extension of my analytical mind. The screen displayed multiple options for wire transfer limits, authorized user management, and standard fraud prevention. But standard was not going to save me today. I needed the absolute nuclear option. I looked down toward the bottom of the long list, signaling Mai to scroll further into the highly restricted administrative settings. A bright red warning banner finally appeared on the screen. It read, Emergency Asset Lockdown Protocol. I stared directly at it and blinked twice hard and fast. Mai hovered her thumb nervously over the red button. Nora, she whispered, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and genuine fear. If I press this, it initiates a total irreversible freeze. The warning explicitly states that every single platinum credit card, every checking account, and your entire trust fund will be completely locked down. It will instantly block all pending wire transfers. It will automatically cut off any secondary authorized users. It will require a federal-level review and an in-person verification with a government-issued ID to ever unlock these funds again. You will not even be able to pay for this hospital room today. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? I did not hesitate for a single second. I blinked twice. Do it. Mai pressed the red button. A secondary security prompt immediately popped up on the screen, demanding a 4-digit biometric override PIN. Facial recognition alone was not enough for a total asset freeze. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I could not speak the numbers aloud to her. I looked at Mai, then shifted my eyes to the blank medical chart resting on the plastic bedside table. Beside the chart lay a blue ballpoint pen. Mai instantly understood my silent request. She picked up the pen and gently placed it into my trembling right hand. My grip was incredibly weak. The newly awakened muscles in my forearms screamed in absolute protest, feeling like they were physically tearing apart under the strain. But sheer adrenaline and righteous fury fueled my erratic movements. I concentrated all my mental energy into my wrist and index finger. With agonizing slowness, I dragged the tip of the blue pen across the back of a paper napkin. The ink strokes were messy, jagged, and barely legible, but the critical numbers were there. 0, 4, 1-5. It was the exact date of my grandfather's death, the heartbreaking day I inherited the foundational wealth that Bradley was now desperately trying to steal from me. Mai read the numbers aloud to confirm. 0415. I tapped my finger once. Yes. She quickly typed the 4 digits into the secure banking application. The system paused for what felt like an eternity. A small loading circle spun endlessly in the center of the screen. Then the entire interface turned solid black. A stark white, unyielding message flashed boldly across the display. All assets frozen. Pending federal review. Account status restricted. It was done. A heavy, triumphant wave of relief washed over me. I let the blue pen slip from my exhausted fingers, falling back into the terrifying reality of my paralyzed state. But my mind was soaring. Mai let out a long breath, quickly closing the application and sliding the phone back into her scrub pocket. She glanced up at the wall clock. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. Bradley is probably walking into the downtown courthouse right now, she said quietly, a sharp, highly satisfied smile forming on her face. He is going to get a massive shock when he tries to move that money. I smiled inwardly. Bradley's meticulously forged medical documents, his high-priced corporate defense attorney, and his emergency conservatorship petition were all completely useless now. Even if the probate judge signed the legal order granting him full financial control in the next hour, Bradley would simply be handed the legal keys to an empty, impenetrable vault. He could not access a single dime without triggering a mandatory federal investigation. I had successfully defended my empire from a hospital bed. Now I just had to wait for the devastating shockwaves of the financial lockdown to hit my enemies. The trap was set, and the rats were already locked inside. While I lay completely immobilized in a heavily guarded hospital bed fighting a silent, desperate war for my financial survival, my sister-in-law Sienna was completely oblivious to the impending collapse of her carefully curated reality. Across town in the gleaming sunlit showroom of a luxury European auto dealership, she was busy obnoxiously celebrating her 31st birthday. Sienna casually sauntered across the polished tile floor, her expensive high heels clicking rhythmically, completely ignoring the horrific fact that her sister-in-law had nearly died 12 hours earlier. For Sienna, my tragic accident was merely an inconvenient interruption to her elaborate party, a temporary, annoying blip in her luxurious lifestyle. She eagerly ran a manicured hand along the matte black hood of a brand-new top-of-the-line Mercedes G-Wagon. "This is absolutely the one," Sienna loudly announced, her shrill voice echoing obnoxiously in the quiet, sophisticated showroom. "It perfectly matches my new aesthetic for the autumn season. And since Bradley is legally taking over Nora's accounts today, we do not even have to worry about the massive down payment." Trey, dressed impeccably in his custom-tailored suit, stood nearby with the dealership's eager sales manager. He nervously checked his solid gold Rolex, looking slightly anxious and sweating lightly. "Bradley texted me 30 minutes ago," Trey said, carefully lowering his deep voice so the manager would not hear. "He said the judge officially signed the emergency conservatorship. He officially has total legal control over the Nora Trust. The funds should be available immediately. Go ahead and put the entire vehicle on the platinum card." Sienna beamed brightly happily, pulling a heavy, solid metal credit card from her expensive designer handbag. It was a secondary card tied directly to my primary wealth management account. A card Bradley had secretly and illegally authorized for her, without my explicit knowledge or consent. She handed it to the eager sales manager with a deeply condescending smile. "Ring it up immediately, and throw in the premium leather care package. I only accept the absolute best." The sales manager nodded enthusiastically, practically scurrying over to the dealership's sleek finance desk. He confidently swiped the heavy metal card through the electronic terminal. Sienna leaned seductively against the G-Wagon, already pulling out her phone to record a live video for her thousands of social media followers. "Hey guys," she purred into the camera lens, dramatically tossing her perfectly styled hair. "Just picking up my little birthday present. Sometimes you just have to treat yourself. You know, blessings on blessings." "Sir, There actually seems to be a slight issue, the sales manager called out, his previously cheerful tone suddenly evaporating into thin air. Trey frowned deeply, aggressively, stuffing his hands into his tailored pockets. What issue? The credit limit on that specific card is practically non-existent. Run the damn thing again. The manager nervously swiped the heavy card a second time. The electronic machine beeped angrily, a harsh, repetitive sound that aggressively cut through the quiet showroom. He looked at the digital screen, the color rapidly draining from his face. I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Trey. The massive transaction is being flatly declined. The system error code says, account frozen, suspected fraudulent activity. The banking system is actually instructing me to physically confiscate the card. Sienna abruptly stopped recording, her perfectly contoured face twisting in furious confusion. Declined. That is physically impossible. Call the stupid bank right now. Do you have any idea who my brother is? Trey did not wait for the trembling manager. He aggressively yanked his own smartphone from his pocket and immediately dialed the private concierge number for the wealth management firm. He paced back and forth furiously near the large showroom window, his voice rising in sheer panic. Yes, this is Trey calling on behalf of Dr. Bradley regarding the Nora Trust. What exactly do you mean, completely locked down? He has a legally binding court-ordered conservatorship. He just left the downtown courthouse. Trey abruptly stopped pacing, the color completely drained from his face as he silently listened to the bank representative on the other end of the secure line. Federal Review. Initiated by who? The primary account holder is completely paralyzed. Trey violently ended the call, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He stared blankly at Sienna, the terrifying realization of their catastrophic failure hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. The massive fortune was entirely gone. The luxury G-Wagon was a dead pipe dream. And much more importantly, the millions of dollars he desperately needed to save his Southside real estate development from defaulting were firmly locked behind an impenetrable financial fortress. Trey, what the hell is going on? Sienna aggressively demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. Why is my card not working? Make them fix it. Shut up, Sienna. Trey fiercely snapped, the polished veneer of the highly successful broker entirely gone. He forcefully grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly toward the dealership exit. We need to leave. Right now. Bradley did not win. Nora legally locked the accounts. Sienna stumbled clumsily in her high heels, looking back sadly at the G-Wagon in sheer despair. But what about my brand new car? It is my birthday. Forget the damn car! Trey viciously yelled, his deep voice echoing loudly as they aggressively pushed through the heavy glass doors. If we do not get a massive wire transfer by 5 o'clock today, my investors are going to literally break my legs. Your brother lied to us. They rushed into the parking lot, the carefully constructed illusion of their immense wealth shattering in an instant. The dominoes were finally beginning to fall. I lay in the sterile silence of my hospital room, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of my oxygen monitor. The digital wall clock now displayed 9:30 in the morning. Mai had quietly exited my room over an hour ago to resume her nursing rounds, leaving me to wait for the inevitable explosion. I did not have to wait very long. The heavy wooden door suddenly burst open, slamming hard against the doorstop. Bradley stormed inside, his face pale and covered in a thick sheen of nervous sweat. He was clutching his smartphone tightly to his ear, pacing furiously at the foot of my hospital bed. The polished, arrogant medical professional from the night before was completely gone. In his place was a cornered, desperate animal, watching the walls close in around him. Even without a speakerphone, I could hear Trey's booming voice vibrating through the receiver. Trey was practically screaming, his usual smooth baritone replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. You lied to me, Bradley, Trey roared through the phone. We are standing at the dealership right now and the credit card was just declined, confiscated by the manager. The bank representative said the entire trust fund is locked down under emergency federal review. What kind of sick game are you playing with my money? Bradley violently stopped his pacing, staring blankly at the blank white wall above my head. Locked down. That is physically impossible. Trey Bradley stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. I literally just walked out of the county courthouse. I have the signed emergency conservatorship order in my hand right now. The judge granted me full legal control over her estate 10 minutes ago. I own those accounts. Well, your piece of paper is completely worthless, Trey yelled back. I could hear the shrill, obnoxious sound of Sienna loudly sobbing in the background about her ruined birthday present. The accounts are completely frozen. If I do not have $2 million wired directly to my lenders by 5 o'clock today, they are going to kill me. And when they are done breaking my legs, I am sending them straight to your fancy suburban clinic. Fix this disaster right now, Bradley, or we both go down for everything. The line went dead with a sharp click. Bradley slowly lowered the phone, his chest heaving up and down. The color entirely drained from his face as the catastrophic reality settled over his shoulders. He possessed the legal authority, but he had just been handed the keys to an empty, impenetrable vault. He turned his head slowly, his cold, dead eyes locking directly onto my face. He walked deliberately toward my bed, his breathing ragged and heavy. He knew. Even though I was a paralyzed victim, he knew I was a senior forensic auditor who always planned 3 steps ahead of my targets. You did this, Bradley whispered, his voice shaking with pure, unhinged malice. I do not know how you managed to pull this off from a hospital bed without moving a single muscle, but you somehow triggered a massive fraud alert. You locked the money. He leaned heavily over me, pressing his hands firmly onto the mattress on either side of my shoulders. His face was mere inches from mine, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee and fear. You think you are so incredibly smart, Nora. You think you can trap me in a financial corner. But you forgot one crucial detail. You are still a paralyzed burden entirely dependent on hospital machinery to stay alive. He reached up slowly, his trembling fingers wrapping tightly around the corrugated plastic tubing of my oxygen mask. If you are going to act like a brain-dead vegetable and refuse to give me the bypass codes, maybe I should just treat you like one. It will look like a simple mechanical failure, a tragic hospital error before the staff could intervene. Nobody will ever suspect a grieving husband. I stared right back into his dark, furious eyes. I was unable to physically struggle or scream for help. My heart monitor began to beep frantically, a rapid, high-pitched alarm sounding as my pulse skyrocketed in sheer terror. His grip tightened mercilessly on the plastic tube. He started to pull the oxygen supply away from my face. My lungs burned instantly, screaming for air. Suddenly, the heavy hospital door was violently shoved open, crashing incredibly loud against the adjacent wall. Bradley jumped backward in pure shock, instantly dropping the plastic oxygen tube onto my chest. I gasped softly, the cool air rushing back into my lungs. I expected to see Dr. Aris or the local homicide detective rushing to my rescue. Instead, 3 tall men wearing dark tactical vests stepped swiftly into the room. The bold yellow letters emblazoned across their chests read FBI. Dr. Bradley, step away from the patient immediately and keep your hands exactly where we can see them, the lead federal agent ordered. His hand rested firmly on his holstered weapon, his stance wide and commanding. Bradley raised his hands defensively, stammering in absolute shock. What is the meaning of this? I am her husband. I am a doctor. I have a court-ordered medical power of attorney. You have no jurisdiction here. The lead agent pulled a folded white document from his tactical jacket pocket, completely ignoring Bradley's frantic protests. Your medical power of attorney is completely irrelevant today, doctor. We are currently executing a federal search warrant at your private physical therapy clinic as we speak. We also have a warrant for your immediate arrest regarding massive healthcare fraud, money laundering, and illegal racketeering. Put your hands behind your back. Bradley collapsed back against the wall, his knees literally buckling under the massive weight of his suddenly collapsing empire. He looked at me one last time, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. I lay perfectly still, my breathing steadying as the oxygen flowed freely through my mask once again. I could not smile on the outside, but my soul was fiercely triumphant. The invincible doctor was finally caught, and the long-awaited audit of his crimes had just become a federal case. The cold metal handcuffs clicked loudly in the quiet hospital room, a definitive sound signaling the absolute end of Bradley's reign over my life and finances. Two federal agents hauled my husband to his feet. He was completely limp, his arrogant posture shattered entirely. He stared at the lead agent with uncomprehending eyes, struggling to process how his perfect crime had unraveled in mere hours. "How could you possibly have a warrant this fast?" Bradley stammered, his voice a hollow whisper. "I just filed the conservatorship. Nobody knows about my private clinic." The lead agent smiled coldly. "You severely underestimated your wife, doctor." At exactly 11:42 last night, the exact moment the paramedics logged your wife's sudden cardiac distress and plummeting heart rate, our cyber division received an encrypted, automated email. It was a fail-safe mechanism, a digital dead man's switch. Nora did not just audit your accounts. She linked her personal health monitoring software to her forensic database. When her smartwatch registered a critical drop in her vital signs, the system assumed she had been incapacitated. It immediately executed a mass data dump to the FBI and IRS. The agent pulled a thick file from his tactical bag and tossed it onto the plastic tray table. It landed with a satisfying thud. 500 pages of meticulously cross-referenced financial records. The agent continued, his tone dripping with professional admiration. "We spent the entire night verifying the data. It is a masterpiece of forensic accounting. She documented every single phantom patient your clinic billed to insurance companies. She tracked the exact routing numbers where illicit funds were washed. Most importantly, she provided the direct link between your clean medical facility and your brother-in-law's illegal real estate syndicate." Bradley physically recoiled as if struck. "Trey?" he choked out. The agent nodded firmly. "Yes, Trey. Your wife tracked over $4 million of dirty syndicate money flowing directly from his shell companies into your clinic's operating accounts. You were cleaning his cash, and he was funding your lavish lifestyle to keep you quiet. The dossier even includes intercepted digital memos where you discuss the laundering percentages. We already have tactical teams picking up Trey at the luxury car dealership right now. Your criminal network was dismantled while you were busy trying to play the grieving husband." Bradley slowly turned his head to look at me. The sheer magnitude of his failure washed over his face. He finally realized I had known everything for months. I had not just stumbled upon a discrepancy yesterday morning. I had been quietly, methodically building a federal case against him while eating breakfast across from him every single day. I smiled at his terrible jokes, attended his boring social events, and slept in his bed, all while tightening a financial noose around his neck. He thought he was the master manipulator, but he was merely a predictable variable in my audit. "You are a monster," Bradley hissed at me, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of fear and pure hatred. "You set me up. You planned this entire thing just to destroy me." The lead agent forcefully grabbed Bradley by the shoulder and shoved him toward the open doorway. "She did not inject herself with a paralytic neurotoxin," the agent snapped sharply. "You made your own choices, doctor. She just made sure there would be permanent, undeniable consequences. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." As they suddenly dragged my husband out into the brightly lit corridor, his expensive designer shoes dragging across the linoleum floor, the hospital staff gathered outside parted in stunned silence. I lay perfectly still in my bed, listening to his frantic, desperate pleas fade away down the hallway. The mechanical hiss of my oxygen monitor was the only sound left in the room. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace settled deep into my bones. The dead man's switch had worked flawlessly. It was the ultimate insurance policy for a woman who knew she was living with a dangerous predator. I had successfully neutralized the immediate physical threat to my life, and I had permanently severed Bradley's access to my wealth. The war was turning entirely in my favor. Trey and Sienna were currently experiencing the explosive fallout of the frozen accounts and the coordinated federal sweep. The toxic family dynamic that had allowed these arrogant, greedy people to thrive was finally collapsing under the crushing weight of federal indictments. My physical body was still trapped in a temporary state of paralysis, but my sharp mind was already calculating the final devastating moves to ensure they never recovered their stolen power. While the FBI was actively dismantling my husband's illegal medical operations, the devastating shockwaves of my financial lockdown were hitting Trey and Sienna with full force. They had been aggressively escorted out of the luxury car dealership by security after causing a massive scene. Now they were standing in the sweltering heat of the dealership parking lot, the carefully constructed facade of their wealthy suburban lives rapidly disintegrating. Trey was pacing furiously next to his leased sports car, his usually smooth demeanor entirely gone. He was frantically dialing Bradley's number over and over, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of rage and sheer panic. "Pick up the phone, you arrogant fool!" Trey hissed through gritted teeth, slamming his fist hard against the roof of his car. Every single call went straight to a generic voicemail. He had no idea his brother-in-law was currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle in handcuffs. "What do you mean he is not answering?" Sienna whined loudly, stomping her expensive high heel against the hot asphalt. She was aggressively jabbing at her own phone screen. "This is entirely his fault. He promised us that money was completely guaranteed today. Now I do not have my G-Wagon, and the dealership manager looked at me like I was some kind of poor street criminal. I am going to absolutely ruin Bradley's life when I see him." "You are going to ruin his life," Trey roared, whipping around to face his wife. The sheer volume of his voice made Sienna physically flinch backward. He stepped toward her, his eyes wild and desperate. "You have absolutely no idea what is actually happening right now, Sienna. This is not about your stupid birthday car. If those accounts are permanently frozen under a federal fraud review, I am a dead man. I used my syndicate lender's money to cover the initial down payments for my Southside real estate development. Bradley was supposed to wash the rest of their cash through his clinic to finalize the construction permits. Without that trust fund wire transfer today, the entire project defaults. Do you know what those lenders do to people who lose their money?" Sienna stared at him, her perfectly contoured face twisting in sudden, genuine horror. "What are you talking about?" "Trey syndicate lenders, wash the cash. You told me you were securing private equity from legitimate hedge funds." "Legitimate hedge funds do not do business with people who have my credit score," Trey snapped brutally, shattering her ignorant illusion. "Bradley and I have been moving dirty money for months to keep our businesses afloat. We needed Nora's trust fund to finally balance the books before the end of the fiscal year. That was the entire point of pushing her down those stairs. We needed her out of the way." Sienna gasped loudly, dropping her expensive designer handbag onto the dirty pavement. "You pushed her. You actually tried to kill my sister-in-law. I did not push her," Trey yelled defensively, running his hands frantically over his face. "Your brilliant brother did. He injected her with some medical-grade paralytic so she could not fight the emergency conservatorship. I just provided the distraction at the party. But none of that matters now because somehow that brilliant auditor managed to lock down $4 million from a hospital bed without moving a single muscle. We are completely out of time and out of options." Before Trey could formulate a desperate escape plan, Sienna's smartphone suddenly began to vibrate violently in her hand. A rapid-fire succession of notifications flooded her lock screen. She looked down, her eyes widening in pure disbelief. It was Instagram, but it was not birthday wishes. "Oh my God," Sienna breathed out, her voice trembling. She unlocked her phone and opened the social media application. Her perfectly curated feed was exploding, but for all the wrong reasons. An anonymous user had just mass-tagged her in a highly detailed, extremely damaging post. The post contained screenshots of leaked banking documents, highlighting the massive overdrafts on her credit cards and the multiple notices of default on their luxury suburban home. But the most devastating part was a clear, high-definition photograph of Trey secretly meeting with a known local organized crime figure at a seedy downtown diner. The caption was brutal and direct. "The fake wealthy lifestyle of Sienna and Trey is officially over. They are broke, drowning in debt, and actively laundering money for the Southside Syndicate. Say goodbye to the country club." Sienna watched in absolute horror as the comments poured in by the hundreds. The elite social circles she had desperately clawed her way into were instantly turning on her. The wealthy wives she considered her closest friends were publicly mocking her fake designer bags and her leased cars. They were actively tagging the local country club administration, demanding her immediate expulsion. Her follower count was dropping by the thousands every single minute. Sienna choked out tears, finally ruining her perfect makeup. It is all over the internet. Everyone knows we are broke. They know about your illegal lenders. I am completely ruined. Trey snatched the phone from her hand, scanning the post with frantic eyes. The color drained from his face entirely. "This is not just a social media rumor, Sienna," he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "These are actual FBI evidence files. Someone leaked the federal investigation." The loud wail of approaching sirens suddenly cut through the heavy summer air. Trey and Sienna froze, slowly turning their heads toward the dealership entrance. 3 dark SUVs with flashing tactical lights aggressively swerved into the parking lot, effectively blocking the only exit. Men wearing dark windbreakers with bold FBI lettering piled out, their weapons drawn, and aimed directly at Trey. Trey slowly raised his hands above his head, the terrifying reality finally crashing down upon him. Bradley had not just failed to secure the money. The entire criminal enterprise had imploded. The federal sweep had officially arrived, and their glamorous, fraudulent life was permanently over. The heavy silence of the hospital room wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. For the first time in 24 hours, I was completely alone, without the looming threat of my husband or his accomplices. The digital clock on the wall quietly flipped to noon. Down the hall, the chaotic whispers of the nursing staff had faded. Bradley was sitting in a federal holding cell. Trey was likely in an interrogation room. Sienna was socially and financially annihilated. The board was nearly clear. As I lay staring at the ceiling, a sudden sharp prickling sensation flared in my left heel. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles suddenly waking up from a deep slumber. I held my breath, focusing all my attention downward. The icy numbness that had gripped my lower half since the horrific tumble down the marble stairs was beginning to thaw. I concentrated on my toes, sending a deliberate command through my nervous system. My big toe twitched. Then my ankle slowly rotated against the rough hospital sheets. Dr. Aris had gravely informed the homicide detective that this specific synthetic neurotoxin usually caused severe flaccid paralysis lasting for weeks, requiring extensive physical rehabilitation. He assumed my rapid cognitive recovery was merely a lucky physiological anomaly. But luck had absolutely nothing to do with it. My accelerated healing was not a medical miracle. It was a meticulously calculated equation. The truth was, I knew exactly what Bradley was planning to do to me long before I ever stepped foot onto that staircase. 3 days before Sienna's obnoxious birthday party, I was sitting alone in my home office, putting the final touches on the devastating forensic audit of Bradley's physical therapy clinic. I had already traced the $4 million of laundered money. I already had enough evidence to send him and Trey to federal prison. But as I reviewed the clinic's master inventory logs, my trained eyes caught a tiny, almost imperceptible discrepancy in the restricted medical supply closet. A single vial of a highly potent, fast-acting spinal nerve block had been quietly deleted from the digital registry. Bradley was an arrogant man, but he was not a complete idiot. I knew he realized I was getting dangerously close to the truth about the missing funds. He had been watching me carefully, noting my late nights in the office and my sudden cold demeanor. I factored his medical background as a former anesthesiology resident into my risk assessment. A cornered predator does not just surrender, it attacks. I deduced that he needed to neutralize me immediately, without raising the immediate suspicion of a messy murder. He needed me alive but entirely incapacitated so he could legally seize my trust fund through an emergency conservatorship to pay off Trey's violent lenders. I could have simply packed a bag, walked out the front door, and handed my audit over to the authorities right then. But if I did that, Bradley would have hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to bury the evidence in endless litigation. He would claim I fabricated the financial documents out of spite. I needed an ironclad guarantee. I needed him to actively commit a desperate, undeniable crime that would immediately trigger a massive federal intervention. I needed to let him spring his trap, but I refused to be a helpless victim. Using my extensive network of medical auditors, I discreetly consulted a toxicology database. I identified the exact chemical compound of the missing nerve block and procured its specific enzymatic inhibitor. It was a powerful neutralizing agent designed to aggressively bind to the neurotoxin and rapidly flush it from the human nervous system. 1 hour before the guests arrived for the birthday party, while Bradley was upstairs admiring his reflection and adjusting his expensive silk tie, I stood in our kitchen and swallowed the entire dose of the inhibitor. I knew it would not prevent the initial shock of the paralysis. The neurotoxin would still hit my system hard enough to drop me to the floor and fool the paramedics. But the inhibitor guaranteed that the paralytic agent would not permanently damage my spinal cord. Instead of weeks of agonizing paralysis, the chemical half-life was reduced to mere hours. I had willingly absorbed his best shot. I took the agonizing fall down those marble stairs, knowing exactly what was waiting for me at the bottom. It was the ultimate terrifying gamble, but the payoff was absolute victory. I slowly bent my right knee, sliding my foot flat against the mattress. The heavy dead weight in my legs was evaporating rapidly, replaced by the burning, glorious ache of returning muscle control. I pushed myself up slightly, adjusting the hospital pillows behind my back. I was no longer a paralyzed asset waiting to be liquidated. I was a fully conscious mobile threat. Bradley had played his final card, and now it was my turn to finish the game. The feeling of the hospital bed sheets against my newly awakened skin was the most profound sensation I had ever experienced. I spent the next 2 hours systematically testing every muscle group, moving from my toes up to my hips. The synthetic neurotoxin was rapidly breaking down, completely neutralized by the chemical inhibitor I had swallowed before the party. I could finally sit up unassisted. The terrifying physical prison my husband had designed for me was crumbling. But my quiet victory was abruptly shattered when the heavy wooden door swung open and Mai rushed inside. Her face was completely drained of color. She was not carrying medical supplies or charting tablets. She was clutching her smartphone tightly to her chest, her breathing shallow and frantic. The homicide detective stationed outside had stepped away, leaving us completely alone. Nora Mai gasped, rushing to my bedside. I just heard the news from the hospital administrators. Bradley made bail. His corporate defense attorney pulled an emergency hearing with a sympathetic federal judge. They used the clinic's remaining unseized physical assets as collateral. He is out, Nora, but that is not even the worst part. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Bradley was desperate, completely stripped of his untouchable facade. A cornered narcissist with massive financial resources was the most dangerous creature on earth. I reached out and gently placed my hand on Mai's arm, urging her to continue. He is trying to destroy you before the criminal trial even begins, Mai whispered, her voice trembling with absolute disgust. He knows the FBI has your forensic audit. He knows he cannot beat the raw financial data, so he is attacking the source. He is trying to completely annihilate your credibility, so the federal prosecutors will drop you as a reliable witness. You need to see what his lawyer just released to the local news stations. Mai turned her smartphone screen toward me and pressed play. My blood ran completely cold. The high-definition video playing on the screen was a masterpiece of digital manipulation. It was set in the brightly lit playroom of the Sunnyvale Children's Home, a local orphanage, where I had volunteered my accounting services for the past 5 years. The camera angle looked like a hidden security feed, but the woman in the center of the frame was the true nightmare. It was me. Or rather, a perfectly rendered digital replica of me. The deepfake was horrifyingly flawless. It captured the exact shade of my hair, the specific cadence of my voice, and the subtle mannerisms of my posture. The digital version of me was screaming viciously at a crying toddler, using horrific profanities. The fake Nora then violently grabbed the child by the arm and shoved him roughly to the floor. The video was visceral, violent, and incredibly convincing. I stared at the screen, my analytical mind racing to dissect the digital atrocity. Bradley had clearly anticipated my resistance. He had hired a professional dark web contractor, spending a fortune to digitally stitch my face and voice onto an actor's body. He had manufactured a scandal so vile that it would instantly turn the entire city against me. Mai paused the video, her hands shaking. "It is going incredibly viral, Nora. The hospital switchboard is already lighting up with angry phone calls and death threats demanding that we kick you out onto the street. Local news anchors are calling you a monster." And Bradley just released a public statement through his attorney. Mai pulled up a press release text. She read it aloud, her voice filled with absolute revulsion. It says, "Dr. Bradley is deeply devastated by the recent public revelations regarding his wife. Nora has been secretly battling severe undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia and violent psychotic breaks. Her recent tragic fall down the stairs exacerbated her severe mental illness, leading her to fabricate wild delusional financial accusations against her own family. Dr. Bradley is filing an emergency petition to place her in a secure psychiatric facility for the safety of the community." The sheer audacity of his strategy was staggering. He was weaponizing the deepfake to achieve two massive goals simultaneously. First, he was poisoning the jury pool and discrediting my FBI audit as the paranoid ramblings of a violently insane woman. Second, he was still pushing forward with the emergency conservatorship. He wanted the probate judge to look at that horrific video and immediately strip away my civil rights, locking me in a padded psychiatric cell where I could never speak against him again. He thought this dirty trick would break me. He thought the public humiliation and the threat of permanent institutionalization would force me to surrender the frozen trust fund in exchange for my freedom. But Bradley had made one final fatal miscalculation. He relied on digital illusions, whereas I only dealt in hard, undeniable facts. I looked at Mai and slowly swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed. My bare feet touched the cold linoleum floor. I stood up, my legs shaking slightly before locking into a firm, solid stance. Mai gasped, dropping her phone onto the mattress. "You can walk," she whispered in pure shock. I looked at her and nodded. I could not speak yet, but my actions were loud and clear. I grabbed a pen and my medical chart. I quickly wrote down the name and private phone number of the most ruthless litigation attorney in Chicago. I handed the paper to Mai. The hospital room was no longer my sanctuary or my prison. It was my staging ground. Bradley wanted to play dirty in front of a judge. I was going to walk directly into that courtroom and bury him alive. Mai did not ask any questions. She took the piece of paper from my hand, pulled her phone back out, and immediately dialed the private number. Within 45 minutes, the heavy hospital door opened again. Veronica Pierce stepped into the room. Veronica was a legendary corporate litigator in Chicago, a woman known for utterly destroying her opponents in the courtroom with surgical precision. She wore a sharp-tailored suit and carried a thick leather briefcase, her expression entirely unreadable. I had worked with Veronica 3 years ago on a massive corporate embezzlement case, providing the forensic accounting that helped her secure a multi-million-dollar settlement. She knew my meticulous nature, and more importantly, she knew I never made an accusation I could not definitively prove with hard numbers. Veronica walked over to my bed, noting that I was sitting completely upright without any assistance. My vocal cords were still incredibly tight, but the paralyzing effect of the neurotoxin was rapidly fading from my system. I took a slow, deep breath and forced the words out. My voice was a raspy, painful whisper, but it was clear enough. "Bradley is trying to bury me," I said, my throat burning intensely with every single syllable. Veronica nodded sharply, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of formal legal filings. She dropped them onto my hospital tray table with a heavy thud. "He is not just trying to bury you, Nora. He is trying to completely erase your legal existence. His attorney just filed an emergency petition with the highest probate court in the county. They bypassed the lower courts entirely. Bradley is requesting a full plenary guardianship, claiming you are suffering from severe violent paranoid schizophrenia and require immediate institutionalization. I looked down at the documents. The paperwork was incredibly aggressive and chillingly thorough. Bradley was explicitly asking the judge to strip me of all my basic civil rights. He wanted the permanent legal authority to seize my passport, intercept my private communications, manage all my financial holdings, and forcibly commit me to a locked psychiatric facility of his choosing. It was a desperate, scorched earth legal strategy designed to completely silence me. He attached that fabricated orphanage video to the official court filing as Exhibit A. Veronica continued, her tone laced with professional disgust. He is aggressively arguing that your recent forensic audit of his medical clinic was entirely fabricated during a severe psychotic break. He claims you locked down the trust fund, not out of self-defense, but because you are having a dangerous manic episode. If the judge grants this emergency petition, Bradley will officially become your total legal guardian. He will have the ultimate authority to march into that bank tomorrow, unfreeze your $4 million trust fund, and claim he needs the money to pay for your lifelong specialized psychiatric care. The terrifying reality of the situation hung heavily in the air. Furthermore, Veronica added, her eyes narrowing, the federal prosecutors will be legally forced to drop their massive fraud investigation against his clinic. They cannot use your audited financial evidence in federal court because their star witness will be legally certified as criminally insane by a state judge. I slowly absorbed the sheer magnitude of his twisted, brilliant plan. Bradley was using the legal system as a weapon of mass destruction. He knew the deepfake video would cause massive public outrage, putting immense political pressure on the judge to act swiftly to protect the community from a supposedly violent woman. It was the ultimate gaslighting maneuver. He was trying to convince the entire judicial system that the victim was actually the dangerous villain. But he made one critical, fatal error, I whispered, gripping the edge of the mattress as I swung my legs back and forth actively, testing my rapidly returning strength. He forgot that a senior forensic auditor knows exactly how to trace complex digital footprints. I looked directly at Veronica. I need you to contact the cybersecurity division of the FBI immediately. Tell them to run a comprehensive metadata analysis on the raw video file Bradley submitted to the court. The deepfake software he used will leave a distinct digital rendering signature. The pixel shadows will absolutely not align with the original lighting of the orphanage playroom. I also need you to formally subpoena the hospital security footage from the exact time he claims I was supposedly suffering a psychotic break. And finally, I need you to finalize the specific documents we privately discussed last month. Veronica smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that promised absolute ruin for my enemies. I already have the documents prepared, signed, and ready, Nora. The emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Bradley and his high-priced lawyer requested a closed-door session to protect your privacy. They are fully expecting you to be wheeled into that courtroom, completely paralyzed and heavily sedated. They think they are going to present their fake evidence to an empty room and walk out with your entire life in their hands. Let them think exactly that, I replied, my voice growing slightly stronger with every passing minute. Let Bradley walk into that courtroom feeling like an untouchable king. I want him to experience the absolute height of his manufactured victory right before we tear his entire empire down to the ground. I stood up from the bed entirely unassisted, my bare feet planted firmly on the cold linoleum. The paralysis was gone. I was ready for war. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B at the downtown Chicago probate court remained tightly sealed. Inside, the atmosphere was incredibly tense and formal. The morning sun filtered through the high-arched windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany benches. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Bradley sat at the primary petitioner table, looking every inch the devoted, grieving husband. He wore an immaculate, charcoal-tailored suit, though he had intentionally loosened his silk tie and messed up his hair just enough to convey the image of a man completely exhausted by family tragedy. Sitting directly behind him in the front row of the gallery was Trey. Despite being arrested by federal agents the previous afternoon, Trey's dangerous syndicate lenders had rapidly posted his massive bail late last night. They did not bail him out of kindness. They bailed him out because this emergency conservatorship hearing was their absolute last chance to recover their stolen millions. If Bradley got control of my trust fund, Trey lived. If not, Trey was a dead man walking. Both men exchanged a brief, anxious look before turning their attention back to the front of the room. Richard Bradley's slick corporate defense attorney stood confidently before the elevated bench. He was currently addressing Judge Harrison, an older, stern magistrate, who was well known in the city for taking matters of mental health and public safety incredibly seriously. Your Honor. Richard began, his voice echoing with practiced theatrical sorrow. We are here today under the most tragic and urgent of circumstances. My client, Dr. Bradley, is petitioning for immediate plenary guardianship over his wife, Nora. Over the past several months, Nora has been suffering from a severe, undiagnosed psychological decline. This condition culminated in a terrifying incident at a family birthday gathering where she threw herself down a flight of stairs during a severe paranoid delusion. Richard paused dramatically, picking up a thick stack of forged medical affidavits and handing them to the court bailiff to pass up to the judge. Following the fall, her psychosis rapidly escalated. Richard continued, shaking his head sadly. While hospitalized, she managed to illegally access her primary financial portals and lock down her entire $4 million trust fund, claiming her loving family was attempting to rob her. But the financial paranoia is merely the tip of the iceberg. Your Honor, we have submitted digital video evidence as Exhibit A, demonstrating that Nora poses an active violent threat to the community. Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the digital tablet Richard had provided. He pressed play on the fabricated deepfake video. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge watched the fake digital replica of me aggressively screaming and pushing a toddler at the local orphanage. The judge's face visibly hardened. He frowned deeply, his jaw tightening in absolute revulsion at the manufactured violence on the screen. This is highly disturbing, Dr. Bradley, Judge Harrison stated, placing the tablet face down on his heavy wooden desk. He looked directly at my husband. Are you absolutely certain this is your wife in the footage? Bradley stood up slowly. He pulled a white cotton handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his eyes, forcing a singular fake tear to roll down his cheek. It breaks my heart to say it, Your Honor. But yes. Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with masterful, deceptive emotion. I love my wife more than anything in this world. I have tried so hard to manage her mental illness privately, but she has become completely unpredictable and deeply violent. I am terrified for her safety and the safety of others. I desperately need this conservatorship so I can legally unfreeze our assets and transfer her to a secure private psychiatric facility where she can finally receive the intensive help she so desperately needs. Trey leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the wooden pew in front of him so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He was practically holding his breath, waiting for the judge to grant them the ultimate financial victory. Judge Harrison sighed heavily, picking up his expensive fountain pen. He looked down at the official legal decree that would permanently strip away every single civil right I possessed. The judicial system is designed to protect those who can no longer protect themselves, the judge stated formally. Given the extreme severity of the video evidence and the supporting medical affidavits signed by a licensed physician, I am highly inclined to grant this emergency plenary guardianship immediately. The risk to the public and to the patient herself is simply too great to ignore. Bradley bowed his head, hiding the vicious, triumphant smirk that was instantly spreading across his face. He had actually done it. He had successfully manipulated the highest probate court in the county. He was seconds away from walking out of that room as the total master of my life and my wealth. The judge uncapped his fountain pen. The sharp metal nib hovered just a fraction of an inch above the signature line on the official court order. However, before I sign this permanent decree, Judge Harrison added, looking up and scanning the quiet room. "I must formally ask if there is any opposing counsel present to contest this emergency petition." Bradley almost laughed out loud. He knew perfectly well that I was supposed to be lying paralyzed and heavily sedated in a hospital bed miles away. He fully expected the room to remain in dead silence. But the silence never came. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a massive echoing crash. Every head in courtroom 4B snapped toward the back of the room. The massive oak doors had not just opened. They had been forcefully shoved apart by the heavy hands of the court bailiff rebounding slightly against the dark wood-paneled walls. The heavy, oppressive silence of the county probate court was instantly shattered by a sharp rhythmic sound. Click, click, click. It was the unmistakable sharp cadence of stiletto heels striking the polished hardwood floor. I stepped over the threshold, completely ignoring the stunned collective gasp that rippled through the small gallery. I was not confined to a bulky hospital wheelchair. I was not wearing a flimsy, degrading medical gown, and I certainly was not heavily sedated or acting out a violent delusion. I was wearing a sharp-tailored crimson power suit that fit my frame perfectly, paired with black pointed toe heels. My posture was impeccably straight, my head held high and my eyes locked with laser precision directly onto the man sitting at the primary petitioner table. I did not walk into that legal battlefield alone. Flanking me on my right was Veronica Pierce, her expensive leather briefcase in hand, radiating an aura of absolute legal destruction. Behind her walked three more of the most ruthless, highly compensated corporate litigators in Chicago, carrying thick binders of verified financial evidence. We moved together down the center aisle like a highly coordinated tactical strike team, arriving to secure a compromised target. Bradley sat frozen in his heavy wooden chair, as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. The smug, triumphant smirk that had adorned his face just seconds ago was entirely eradicated, wiped clean by sheer, unadulterated terror. His mouth hung open slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at my legs moving flawlessly beneath me. The fabricated narrative he had just sold to the judge was imploding right in front of his eyes. He reached out and gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white, as if he was trying to anchor himself to a reality that was rapidly dissolving around him. In the gallery directly behind him, Trey looked like he was going to be physically sick. He slumped back against the rigid wooden pew, all the breath violently knocked out of his lungs. He understood the immediate catastrophic implications of my entrance far better than anyone else in that room. A paralyzed, insane woman could be easily robbed in the dark. A fully mobile, furious forensic auditor walking into a courtroom with a team of elite lawyers meant federal prison or worse, a highly unpleasant visit from his violent syndicate lenders. His massive gamble had failed. Richard, the slick corporate defense attorney, scrambled awkwardly to his feet. His polished, arrogant demeanor completely evaporated into thin air. He looked frantically from the forged medical affidavits sitting on the judge's desk to my perfectly healthy figure marching confidently down the aisle. He opened his mouth to shout an objection, but no words came out. There was absolutely no legal precedent for a supposedly comatose, permanently paralyzed patient aggressively crashing her own emergency conservatorship hearing. Judge Harrison slowly lowered his expensive fountain pen, carefully placing it far away from the signature line. He took off his reading glasses, rubbing his eyes for a brief second, as if he could not believe what he was seeing in his own courtroom. He looked at the deepfake video still frozen on his digital tablet, then looked directly at me. The stark, undeniable contrast between the screaming, violent woman on the screen and the composed, elegantly dressed professional standing before him was absolute. We reached the front of the courtroom. I stopped directly next to the petitioner table, standing so close to Bradley I could clearly smell his expensive cologne mixing heavily with his cold, nervous sweat. I did not say a single word to him. I did not have to. My mere physical presence was a devastating blow that shattered his entire elaborate defense. I simply looked down at him, my expression completely blank, offering him exactly the same amount of mercy he had offered me when I lay paralyzed at the bottom of our stairs. None. Veronica Pierce stepped smoothly up to the main podium, completely taking command of the room before Richard could even formulate a coherent sentence. "Good morning, Your Honor." Veronica announced, her voice crisp, clear, and ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "For the official court record, I am Veronica Pierce, representing the respondent Nora. And as the court can clearly see with its own eyes, my client is fully conscious, entirely mobile, and in complete possession of her mental faculties." Judge Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands tightly over the unsigned emergency petition. Counsel, the judge started, his voice thick with severe confusion and rising judicial anger. "I was just informed, under the strict penalty of perjury, that your client was suffering from a severe paralyzing medical event and violent psychological delusions." Veronica smiled coldly, placing her briefcase onto the wooden podium. "Your Honor, my client has indeed suffered a trauma, but it was not a medical event. It was a highly calculated attempted murder, and we are here to officially dismantle every single lie presented in this courtroom today." Richard practically tripped over his own feet as he lunged back toward the petitioner table. He was desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of his highly lucrative legal career. "Your Honor, this is a highly irregular and completely inappropriate disruption," Richard stammered loudly, his voice echoing in the large room. "Regardless of her current physical appearance, my client is still her legal husband. As her spouse, Dr. Bradley possesses the statutory right to act as her medical proxy and financial guardian. We ask that she be immediately remanded to a medical facility for a proper psychological evaluation." Veronica Pierce did not even blink. She turned slowly to face Richard, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "He is not her husband," Veronica stated, her voice slicing through the courtroom like a freshly sharpened blade. She calmly reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bond paper adorned with a raised gold seal. She handed the document to the court bailiff, who promptly walked it up to the elevated wooden bench. "What you are currently holding, Your Honor, is a finalized, legally binding decree of divorce," Veronica announced to the dead silent room. "It was officially signed, notarized, and recorded by the county family court exactly 30 days prior to my client being pushed down those stairs." Bradley erupted from his chair, his face flushing a violent shade of red. "That is an absolute lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "I never signed any divorce papers. We still live in the same house. We share the same bank accounts. This is a fabricated document." I stepped forward, moving away from my legal team so I was standing directly in his line of sight. My voice was still slightly raspy, but it was steady and filled with absolute authority. "You did sign it, Bradley," I said clearly. "You just never bothered to read it." The courtroom remained completely silent, hanging on my every word. I turned my attention to the judge to explain. "Your Honor, as a senior forensic auditor, I personally managed all of my former husband's complex financial portfolios. 3 months ago, I presented him with a massive 500-page corporate restructuring binder. I told him it was necessary to optimize his physical therapy clinic for the upcoming fiscal year. Because Bradley is incredibly arrogant and only cares about the bottom line, he never reads the legal paperwork I prepare for him. He simply flips to the yellow sticky notes and signs his name." I looked back at Bradley, watching the horrifying realization slowly dawn in his eyes. I buried the marital dissolution agreement and the complete separation of our personal assets on page 240 of that binder. I continued coldly. "You signed it perfectly on the dotted line. Your own clinic receptionist notarized the signature. You voluntarily gave up all marital rights, all claims to my generational trust fund, and all medical proxy privileges. You legally became a complete stranger to me a month ago. You were just too busy laundering dirty money to notice." Judge Harrison stared intensely at the heavy document in his hands. He carefully examined the signatures, the dates, and the official county seal. His face slowly turned a dangerous, furious shade of purple. He looked down at Bradley with a gaze that could have melted solid steel. "Dr. Bradley," The judge growled, his voice vibrating with severe judicial wrath. You just stood in my courtroom under oath and presented a highly fabricated medical petition. You demanded emergency control over the civil rights and the massive financial estate of a woman you are no longer legally related to in any capacity. You attempted to use this court to commit a multi-million-dollar fraud. Richard physically backed away from Bradley, throwing his hands up in the air. Your Honor, I must state for the official court record that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this finalized divorce decree. Richard practically shouted desperately, throwing his own client under the bus to save his legal license. My client completely misrepresented his marital status to my firm. Bradley was hyperventilating now. He grabbed his chest, his perfectly tailored suit jacket suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He looked back at Trey, searching for some kind of support, but Trey was already backing away toward the heavy oak doors. Trey realized that the massive trust fund was permanently out of reach. The $2 million he owed to the violent real estate syndicate was never going to materialize. The emergency conservatorship petition was completely dead. Bradley had absolutely zero legal standing to make any decisions on my behalf. He could not touch my money. He could not dictate my medical care. He could not force me into a locked psychiatric ward. The impenetrable legal fortress he thought he was building around me had just been completely demolished by a single piece of paper. He had tried to play a game of legal chess with a woman who audited corporate contracts for a living, and he had been checkmated before he even realized the game had begun. The crushing weight of the finalized divorce decree suffocated Bradley for exactly 10 seconds. Then the sheer narcissistic panic morphed into violent, unhinged rage. He forcefully shoved his heavy wooden chair backward. It screeched against the polished floor, echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged courtroom. He was no longer trying to play the grieving, concerned spouse. His mask had completely melted away, revealing the desperate, greedy predator underneath. Fine. Bradley roared, his voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. His face was contorted with fury. He aggressively pointed his finger at me, completely ignoring the stern warnings from Judge Harrison to maintain order. Fine. So you tricked me into signing a piece of paper. You sneaked a divorce decree into a corporate audit. That does not change the financial reality of our marriage, Nora. You do not get to just walk away with everything and leave me with nothing. He turned wildly back to the judge, slamming his hands flat onto the petitioner table. Your Honor. Even if that divorce decree is technically valid, the division of marital assets has not been properly executed. She locked down the trust fund, but she cannot legally touch my physical therapy clinic. I built that medical practice from the ground up during our marriage. It is a joint marital asset. I have the absolute statutory right to 50% of its total valuation, plus spousal support. She is acting out of pure vindictive spite to bankrupt my legitimate business. Richard, his former attorney, stood completely frozen in the corner of the room, desperately pretending he was entirely invisible. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with Bradley's spontaneous legal arguments. In the gallery, Trey had stopped backing toward the door. He paused, a tiny flicker of desperate hope reigniting in his eyes. If Bradley could successfully force the court to liquidate the clinic and award him half its value, there might still be enough cash to pay off the violent Southside Syndicate lenders. I stood perfectly still, watching my ex-husband hyperventilate in the center of the courtroom. The sheer audacity of his greed was almost impressive. He had literally paralyzed me, tried to steal my entire $4 million generational trust fund, and attempted to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. Yet here he was, aggressively demanding a generous severance package. I glanced at Veronica Pierce. My fierce corporate litigator did not interrupt him. She simply let him dig his own grave deeper. Dr. Bradley. Judge Harrison boomed loudly, striking his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack instantly silenced Bradley's furious rant. You are standing in a probate court, not a family court. However, since you have actively attempted to defraud this specific bench using forged medical documents, I am going to allow the respondent to address your sudden claims regarding the marital assets. If you interrupt her, I will have the bailiff arrest you for contempt of court immediately. Do you understand me? Bradley swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw twitching violently. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod, his chest heaving with exertion. He glared at me with absolute venom, completely convinced that he still held a winning card. He genuinely believed that the clinic was his impenetrable fortress, a multi-million-dollar asset that I could not legally touch without his explicit consent. I stepped up to the wooden podium standing right next to Veronica. I did not need a microphone. My voice had fully recovered from the neurotoxin ringing with crystal-clear, undeniable authority. Your Honor, I stated calmly, looking directly into the judge's eyes. My ex-husband is entirely correct about one specific legal point. The physical therapy clinic was indeed built during our marriage. However, he is completely wrong about the current ownership structure and its classification as a joint marital asset. Bradley sneered openly, crossing his arms over his chest. He was practically vibrating with arrogant confidence. You cannot rewrite history. Nora, he hissed under his breath, directly violating the judge's warning. My name is on the original deed. My name is on the primary business license. It is my clinic. I slowly turned my head to look directly into his deeply dark, furious eyes. I let a cold, calculated, razor-sharp smile finally break across my face. Yes, Bradley, your given name was indeed on the original paperwork, I replied smoothly. But building a highly legitimate business requires actual tangible capital. When you secretly drained my accounts to cover your massive gambling debts and your brother-in-law's failing real estate projects, you created a catastrophic cash flow problem for your precious clinic. You needed immediate emergency operational funding. And as your diligent financial auditor, I found the perfect corporate investor to completely bail you out. What corporate investor? Bradley demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden sharp edge of panic. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his fingers looked like they might snap. What are you talking about? I secured that funding through an independent private equity firm. I handled that transaction entirely on my own. I held my hand out to my right. Veronica Pierce reached into her leather briefcase one final time and produced a thick, sleek black binder. She placed it firmly into my waiting hand. I opened the binder, extracted a heavy, notarized commercial mortgage agreement, and handed it directly to the court bailiff. Your Honor, I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. 7 months ago, my former husband was desperate for clean operating capital to keep his physical therapy clinic from collapsing under the weight of his hidden debts. He authorized a high-interest $2 million commercial mortgage against the physical property and all future revenue of his medical practice. Bradley scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up in a theatrical display of exasperation. So what he shouted, looking around the room as if expecting someone to agree with him. Taking out a business loan is not a crime. I had every legal right to leverage my own company. The clinic is still valued at over $3 million. Even with the debt, there is massive equity left over. The court will simply order the forced liquidation of the business. We will pay off the lender, and I will take my rightful 50% of the remaining profits. You get nothing but a massive legal bill, Nora. I slowly shook my head, offering him a look of absolute chilling pity. You really should have read the fine print, Bradley. I explicitly warned you about rushing into aggressive financial contracts. I turned my attention back to the bench. Judge Harrison was already scanning the first few pages of the mortgage agreement, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. As the court can clearly see, I stated the primary creditor listed on that mortgage is the Blackwood Investment Group. It is a highly aggressive private equity firm known for its predatory lending structures. The specific contract Bradley signed contains a zero-tolerance accelerated default clause. Bradley rolled his eyes, clearly missing the impending danger. So what if they have a strict default clause? I will simply have my corporate lawyers call Blackwood this afternoon. They are just a faceless financial institution. We can easily negotiate a temporary settlement or file for Chapter 11 restructuring to stall their collection efforts. They just want their money back. They do not want to negotiate with you, Bradley, I replied softly, letting the absolute finality of my words hang heavy in the air. I pulled one last single sheet of paper from the black binder. It was a certified certificate of corporate incorporation stamped with the official seal of the state of Delaware. I handed it to the bailiff, who promptly delivered it to the judge. According to Section 4, Paragraph B of your mortgage agreement, I recited entirely from memory, my eyes never leaving Bradley's pale face. The loan goes into immediate incurable default if the primary business owner is formally indicted on federal charges of fraud, money laundering, or racketeering. Because the FBI raided your clinic yesterday and formally placed you under federal arrest, that specific clause was automatically triggered at exactly 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Bradley swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Fine, he stammered, his arrogance finally beginning to crack. So Blackwood seizes the building. I will still sue them for the remaining equity. I will drag their anonymous board of directors into this very courtroom and depose every single one of them. You will not need to issue any subpoenas, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step away from the podium and moving closer to him. You do not need to call their corporate office, and you certainly do not need to look for their anonymous board of directors. Judge Harrison looked up from the incorporation document, his eyes wide with profound, unprecedented shock. He looked at me, then looked down at Bradley, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Blackwood was my grandfather's middle name, I announced, my voice ringing with total uncompromising victory. 5 years ago, I used a portion of my inheritance to establish an anonymous holding company to aggressively manage high-yield alternative investments. I am the sole managing director, the primary shareholder, and the acting chairman of the Blackwood Investment Group. The entire courtroom ceased to breathe. The absolute silence was deafening. Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for an exit from the terrifying reality that was crashing down upon him. You do not own a multi-million-dollar marital asset, Bradley, I whispered, the cold satisfaction burning brightly in my chest. You own a massive, unpayable debt. You literally handed me the deed to your entire company 7 months ago. You mortgaged your only asset directly to your own wife, and you were too blind by your own greed to even realize it. As of this morning, Blackwood Investment Group has legally repossessed the clinic, all its medical equipment, and the surrounding property. You have absolutely nothing left to divide. Bradley's knees finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, staring blankly at the floor, as the total, undeniable destruction of his life finally took hold. He was completely bankrupt, facing decades in federal prison, and he had orchestrated his own magnificent downfall. Bradley remained slumped in his heavy wooden chair, his arrogant posture completely broken. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany floor, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the financial trap I had systematically built around him. The deepfake video, the forged medical affidavits, and the emergency conservatorship petition were all completely irrelevant now. He had attempted to aggressively steal my generational wealth, not realizing I had already used that exact wealth to quietly purchase the very ground he stood upon. Judge Harrison was the first to break the heavy, stunned silence of the courtroom. The magistrate looked over the Delaware Corporate Incorporation document one more time, verifying my signature alongside the raised state seal. He looked down at Bradley with a mixture of absolute judicial disgust and cold pity. Dr. Bradley, the judge, began, his voice echoing loudly across the large room. It appears your emergency petition is not only legally fraudulent but entirely moot. You do not possess any remaining marital assets for this court to divide. The physical therapy clinic, along with its associated revenue streams and physical equipment, is officially the lawful property of the Blackwood Investment Group due to your own financial default. Bradley slowly raised his head, his face a terrifying mask of pale, sweating desperation. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. You set me up, He choked out his voice, barely a raw, frantic whisper. You purposefully let me take out that massive commercial loan just so you could secretly buy the debt and bankrupt me. I did not let you do anything, Bradley, I replied calmly, stepping slightly closer to the petitioner table. My voice remained steady and entirely devoid of any sympathy. You came to me 7 months ago, begging for a financial lifeline because your brother-in-law's illegal real estate syndicate was demanding their laundered cash back. I gave you a highly detailed list of reputable low-interest commercial lenders. You blatantly ignored my professional advice because you did not want to submit to their rigorous federal background checks. You chose to sign a high-risk, zero-tolerance contract with an aggressive private equity firm because they promised fast cash with zero questions asked. I simply used my holding company to provide the exact toxic rope you so desperately requested. You tied the knot all by yourself. Trey, who had been listening to the exchange from the gallery, suddenly stood up. His massive frame was shaking violently. He did not care about the clinic or Bradley's medical license. He only cared about the brutal, violent consequences awaiting him on the south side of Chicago. Wait a minute, Trey yelled, his deep voice cracking with pure terror. He completely ignored the bailiff stepping toward him. If Blackwood just seized the clinic, what happens to the $2 million in operating capital that was sitting in the business accounts this morning? My syndicate lenders need that cash by 5 o'clock today. I turned my attention to Trey, letting a cold, humorless smile touch my lips. That capital no longer exists, Trey. When the federal accelerated default clause was officially triggered yesterday afternoon, Blackwood Investment Group immediately seized all liquid assets tied to the clinic's corporate accounts to cover the outstanding mortgage balance. Your laundered syndicate money is officially gone. Trey's eyes rolled back slightly, his knees buckling. He fell back heavily onto the wooden pew, his head dropping into his hands. He was a dead man, and he knew it. But I was not finished. The financial audit of their deceitful lives was absolute and comprehensive. And it is not just the clinic, Bradley. I continued, my voice slicing cleanly through his rising panic. When you signed that commercial mortgage, you legally attached a cross-collateralization clause to secure the massive loan. You leveraged our suburban estate and your luxury vehicles against the clinic's debt. Bradley gasped loudly, his hand flying to his chest as if he had been physically shot. The house. You took my house. I did not take anything, I corrected him sharply. The bank repossessed it. When I initiated the total lockdown of my personal trust fund from my hospital bed yesterday, it automatically triggered a hard freeze on all secondary credit accounts. Without my trust fund actively covering your massive hidden overdrafts, the mortgage on the suburban estate immediately defaulted. The bank executed a rapid foreclosure this morning. Right now, a private security team is officially changing the locks on the front doors. Sienna's beloved Mercedes G-Wagon, your leased Porsche, and the entire suburban illusion you both desperately clung to are completely gone. Bradley looked around the grand courtroom, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a legal loophole, a sympathetic ear, or any possible escape route. There was none. He had walked into courtroom 4B, expecting to be crowned a king, inheriting a massive fortune from a paralyzed, helpless victim. Instead, he was walking out with absolutely nothing. No clinic, no house, no cars, no money. He was completely, utterly bankrupt, stripped bare by the very woman he had attempted to permanently destroy. Judge Harrison brought his heavy wooden gavel down hard, the sharp crack signaling the absolute end of Bradley's reign. This emergency conservatorship hearing is officially dismissed with extreme prejudice, the judge roared. Bailiff, please contact the federal marshals immediately. Inform them that Dr. Bradley's bail conditions have drastically changed, and he needs to be taken back into federal custody, pending his criminal trial for major healthcare fraud. 2 armed court officers immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bradley roughly by the arms and hauling his limp, defeated body out of the heavy wooden chair. The ultimate payoff had finally arrived, and the final audit was perfectly balanced. As the armed court officers hauled Bradley up from his heavy wooden chair, his expensive shoes dragging against the polished mahogany floor, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open for a third time. This time it was not another corporate lawyer or a confused family member. It was the homicide detective from the hospital walking shoulder to shoulder with the local police chief. They marched purposefully down the center aisle, their expressions set in absolute stone. Bradley struggled weakly against the strong grip of the court officers, but all the remaining fight instantly evaporated from his body the moment he saw what the detective was carrying. In his right hand, the detective held a clear plastic evidence bag. Resting inside the plastic was a familiar, sleek piece of technology. It was my smartwatch. Judge Harrison looked up, clearly exhausted by the endless revelations in his courtroom today. Chief, the judge stated, "You have impeccable timing. We are just about to transfer Dr. Bradley to federal custody. I apologize for the dramatic interruption." "Your Honor," the police chief announced, flashing his gold badge toward the bench. "But since the suspect is conveniently already standing in your courtroom, we are here to officially serve the state warrants. We are adding premeditated attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder to Dr. Bradley's existing federal indictments." The judge nodded slowly, gesturing for the chief to present his findings. The chief turned his cold, uncompromising attention directly to my ex-husband, who was now sweating profusely and trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. "You genuinely thought you committed the perfect crime, Doctor?" the chief said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. "You arrogantly assumed your wife's chemically induced paralysis would silence her permanently. You thought her body would just become a convenient tragic accident. But you completely forgot that modern technology is always listening to everything we do." The homicide detective stepped forward, placing a small digital playback speaker onto the petitioner table right in front of Bradley. He synced the device to the extracted data from my watch. "Your wife's smartwatch was actively recording her biometric data and ambient audio for a specialized health tracking application. When she fell," the detective explained. He pressed a button. The high-definition audio instantly filled the courtroom. First, the muffled, thumping bass of party music playing in the background. Then Bradley's distinct, arrogant voice sounding cold and calculating. "Make sure she is standing right near the edge," the recorded voice hissed. A second voice, unmistakably Trey's deep, resonant baritone, immediately replied. "Just do it fast, Bradley. If we do not get her trust fund money today, my syndicate lenders will literally kill me. I am not going down for your clinic's messy accounting." Then came the most chilling sound of all. The audio captured a sharp, sudden gasp from me as the needle pierced my spine, followed by the scuffle of expensive leather shoes slipping on the marble floor. The recording ended with the horrific, violently loud tumbling of a human body falling down 12 solid steps, crashing heavily at the bottom. Trey leaped up from his seat in the gallery, his face completely drained of all blood. He lunged frantically toward the exit, desperate to escape the massive legal trap that had just snapped shut around him. But two federal marshals had already quietly positioned themselves by the heavy oak doors. They expertly tackled Trey to the polished hardwood floor, driving their knees into his back and snapping heavy metal cuffs around his wrists. The audio recording had just definitively implicated him as a direct accomplice to an attempted homicide. He was no longer just facing financial ruin. He was facing life in a state penitentiary. Bradley stared at the small black speaker on the table in absolute, unadulterated horror. He had been so incredibly focused on executing the financial takeover and manipulating the probate courts that he had completely ignored the digital footprint of his violent physical attack. But a digital audio recording is only half of the equation. The police chief continued, his voice ringing with undeniable authority over Trey's muffled curses from the floor. "During the coordinated federal raid on your luxury physical therapy clinic yesterday afternoon, my officers executed a secondary, highly specific search warrant on your private medical office. Hidden cleverly behind a fake bookshelf was a biometric wall safe. Inside that safe, wrapped in a sterile towel, We found a single partially empty glass vial of a highly restricted synthetic neurotoxin. The detective held up a heavily redacted laboratory document. We rushed the vial to the state crime lab overnight on an emergency priority order, the detective stated flatly. The complex chemical composition of the fluid inside your private safe is a 100% perfect match to the toxicology report drawn directly from Nora's blood at the hospital. You literally kept the murder weapon locked in your own office. The final devastating piece of the puzzle snapped perfectly into place. There was absolutely no circumstantial defense left for Bradley to exploit. No expensive, fast-talking corporate lawyer in the entire country could spin a sympathetic story out of a direct audio recording of the conspiracy and the exact chemical weapon locked inside the suspect's personal vault. The ironclad evidence was insurmountable, entirely sealing his fate. The heavy silence in courtroom 4B was violently broken by the harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around Bradley's wrists. He did not put up a physical fight. The absolute certainty of the digital recording and the physical vial of neurotoxin had completely drained the fight from his body. He stood there, his expensive charcoal suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a broken man. The homicide detective spun him around, reading him his Miranda rights, in a flat, uncompromising tone that echoed off the mahogany walls. Trey was currently being dragged to his feet by the two federal marshals in the gallery. His custom-tailored jacket was torn at the shoulder, his silk tie ripped and hanging loosely around his neck. As the marshals pulled him toward the heavy oak doors, Trey locked eyes with Bradley. The sheer hatred radiating from Trey was palpable. "You ruined everything!" Bradley Trey roared, his deep voice cracking with raw fury. "You told me you had this under control. You told me the trust fund was guaranteed. Now I am going to federal prison, and the syndicate is going to go after my wife. I hope you rot in a concrete cell." Bradley flinched as Trey was forcibly shoved out of the courtroom, the doors slamming shut behind the disgraced real estate broker. The echo of Trey's threats lingered heavily in the air. Bradley slowly turned his head to look at me. His arrogant facade was entirely stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, desperate shell of the man I had once married. "Nora, please, Bradley," whispered his voice, trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Please tell them to stop. We can fix this. I will give you the clinic. I will give you everything. Just tell the detective it was a massive misunderstanding. You know I would never actually hurt you." I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. I stepped closer to him, ensuring he could clearly hear every single word I said. "You already gave me the clinic, Bradley," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "And the audio recording proved exactly how much you were willing to hurt me to get what you wanted. You did not just push me down a flight of stairs. You injected a paralyzing poison directly into my spine and left me trapped inside my own body, all while planning to lock me in a psychiatric ward forever. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a highly accurate audit of your actions, and the final balance is due right now." The police chief placed a firm hand on Bradley's shoulder, aggressively pushing him forward. "Let us go, doctor," the chief commanded. "You have a very long afternoon of federal processing ahead of you." I watched as the homicide detective and the police chief escorted my former husband down the center aisle. The man who had terrorized me, stolen from me, and attempted to legally erase my existence was now shuffling awkwardly in iron chains. He kept his head bowed, unable to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. The heavy oak doors opened one final time, swallowing him into the dark hallway and out of my life forever. Judge Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh from the bench. He took off his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly exhausted by the unprecedented drama that had just unfolded in his probate court. "Miss Nora Judge Harrison," said deliberately, using my first name and dropping the marital title entirely. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a more calculated attempt to weaponize the judicial system. I commend your extraordinary resilience and your brilliant legal strategy. I will personally ensure that all records of this fraudulent emergency petition are permanently expunged from the county database. You are completely free to go and your assets remain entirely under your own control. Thank you. Your Honor, I replied, offering a respectful nod to the bench. Veronica Pierce snapped her thick leather briefcase shut, the sharp sound signaling the absolute end of the legal battle. She turned to me, a rare, genuine smile warming her usually fierce features. "It is officially over, Nora," Veronica said softly. "We won." I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air of the courtroom. My legs, which had been completely paralyzed just 24 hours ago, felt incredibly strong and grounded beneath me. The toxic, suffocating weight of my marriage was gone. The immediate threat of physical and financial destruction was completely neutralized. Justice had not just been served, it had been meticulously calculated, brutally executed, and perfectly balanced. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B, leaving the suffocating drama of my former marriage behind me forever. Veronica Pierce offered me a firm handshake and a respectful nod before heading toward the court clerk office to file the final dismissal paperwork. I turned my attention toward the main corridor, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor of the courthouse. The air felt incredibly light. For the first time in years, I was not analyzing hidden financial ledgers or looking over my shoulder for the next betrayal. I was simply walking toward the exit, a completely free and independent woman. But the toxic remnants of Bradley's family had one final desperate play to make. As I approached the grand bank of brass elevators at the end of the long hallway, a disheveled figure stepped out from behind a marble pillar. It was Sienna. The transformation she had undergone in the past 24 hours was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, perfectly styled socialite who had demanded a luxury vehicle for her birthday was entirely gone. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, with dark streaks of mascara running down her flushed cheeks. She clutched her expensive leather handbag tightly to her chest, like a protective shield, looking frantically around the empty corridor. She had clearly been waiting for me outside the courtroom, too terrified to actually walk inside and face the federal marshals. She had seen Trey being dragged out in handcuffs just minutes earlier, and the brutal reality of her new life had finally crushed her completely. Nora Sienna gasped, stumbling forward and reaching out with trembling hands. Her voice was a pathetic, broken whine. "Oh my God, Nora, you have to help me. You have to tell them to stop." I stopped walking, keeping a firm distance between us. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at her, my expression completely blank and devoid of any sympathy. My silent, analytical stare only made her panic escalate further. They took Trey. Sienna sobbed, tears spilling rapidly down her face. Federal agents literally tackled him in the hallway. They said he is facing decades in prison for racketeering. I tried to go back to our house, but there were private security guards standing at the front gate. The bank changed the locks, Nora. They would not even let me inside to pack a suitcase. My credit cards are all declining. My friends are blocking my phone calls because of that horrific Instagram post. I have absolutely nowhere to go and no money to my name. She took another step closer, her eyes wide with desperate, pleading hope. "I know Bradley did terrible things to you. I know he is a monster. But I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I did not know they were laundering money. I did not know he hurt you. We are still family, Nora. You cannot just leave me out on the street. Please, you have to unfreeze the trust fund. Just give me enough cash to hire a lawyer for Trey and get an apartment. You have millions of dollars. You will not even miss it." I looked at this pathetic, parasitic woman standing in front of me. She was still incredibly blind to her own sheer cruelty. She genuinely believed that playing the ignorant victim would magically erase years of her entitled abuse. "You knew exactly who they were, Sienna." I finally spoke, my voice cold and hard as the marble floor beneath our feet. "You never cared where the money came from as long as it kept flowing into your bank account. You happily spent stolen funds to fund your fake, luxurious lifestyle on social media." Sienna shook her head frantically, trying to deny it, but but I stepped forward, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Do not stand there and tell me you are innocent." I continued, my words slicing through her pathetic sobbing. "When I lay completely paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs fighting for my life, you did not call an ambulance. You stood over my broken body and loudly complained that I was ruining your birthday cake. You told me to stop making a scene. And the very next morning, while I was trapped in a hospital bed recovering from a chemical neurotoxin, you happily walked into a luxury car dealership and tried to buy a Mercedes with a stolen credit card tied directly to my name." "But I am your family!" Sienna wailed, her voice cracking in pure desperation. "You are not my family," I stated with absolute finality. "You are a parasite who finally killed her host. And now you have to face the real world without a stolen credit card to protect you." The absolute finality in my voice shattered her remaining composure. Sienna's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the dirty courthouse floor, her expensive dress pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, begging me for mercy, for a loan, for any tiny scrap of the wealth she felt she was fundamentally entitled to. I looked down at her crying on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I reached out and pressed the brass button for the elevator. "Clean up your own mess, Sienna," I said quietly. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside the empty cabin, turning around to face the hallway. Sienna was still kneeling on the marble floor, weeping loudly and reaching one trembling hand out toward me. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply stood perfectly still as the metal doors slowly glided shut, completely cutting off her pathetic cries and permanently severing her from my life. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me down to the ground floor. When I walked out of the courthouse lobby and stepped into the bright, warm Chicago sunlight, I took a deep breath of fresh air. The empire had fallen, and I was finally ready to build a new one. Exactly 365 days later, the bright morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office. I stood with my hands resting lightly on my hips, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent skyline of downtown Chicago. The view from the 42nd floor was absolutely breathtaking, a daily tangible reminder of the monumental heights I had conquered. I took a deep sip of black coffee, feeling the heat radiate comfortably through my chest. My physical body was completely healed. The lingering phantom aches of the synthetic neurotoxin had vanished entirely months ago, replaced by the solid, undeniable strength of a woman who had willingly walked through the fire and emerged entirely unscathed. I wore a sharply tailored ivory power suit, a stark, deliberate contrast to the sterile hospital gowns and the dark, suffocating shadows of my past marriage. Blackwood Investment Group was no longer just a quiet, anonymous holding company hiding behind a Delaware post office box. Following the massive financial collapse of my ex-husband, we had aggressively expanded our operations, taking over the entire top floor of this prime commercial real estate building. The physical therapy clinic that Bradley had so foolishly mortgaged to me was swiftly liquidated. I took immense pleasure in reinvesting those specific assets into high-yield, legitimate medical technology startups that actively helped patients recover from spinal injuries. My generational wealth had not just been protected, it had exponentially multiplied. I had successfully built an impenetrable fortress of absolute financial security, surrounded by a dedicated team of fiercely loyal analysts and top-tier attorneys who deeply understood the true value of relentless precision. The past year had also delivered the final undeniable balance to the ledgers of my enemies. Bradley was currently serving a 25-year federal sentence at a maximum security penitentiary. His medical license was permanently revoked, his professional reputation entirely pulverized, and his immense arrogance shattered against the cold concrete walls of his cell. Trey had received 15 years for his direct role in the money laundering syndicate trading his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The violent South Side lenders he feared so much had ensured his time inside was anything but peaceful. And Sienna, completely stripped of her stolen wealth and ousted from her elite social circles in absolute disgrace, was last seen working the late-shift register at a discount retail store in the outer suburbs. She was finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of a life she actually had to earn. The parasitic rot had been completely and surgically excised from my world. I turned away from this breathtaking glass window and walked purposefully over to my expansive mahogany desk. I set my coffee cup down next to a sleek, high-definition camera mounted on a tripod. I pressed the record button. A small, red light illuminated the quiet room. I looked directly into the camera lens. Today, I was not speaking to my board of directors or my financial analysts. I was speaking directly to anyone out there who had ever felt the cold, suffocating grip of betrayal. I was speaking to the people who were currently standing at the bottom of their own metaphorical staircase, completely bruised, broken, and wondering if they would ever find the strength to stand back up. Betrayal rarely comes from a masked stranger hiding in a dark alley. I said, my voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute conviction. The most dangerous predators in this world do not break through your windows. They carry the keys to your front door. They sleep in your bed. They smile warmly at your family dinners, and they slowly, methodically drain your resources while softly whispering that they love you. They rely entirely on your silence. They bank heavily on your shock. They build their fraudulent empires on the arrogant assumption that you will be too paralyzed by the emotional pain to ever fight back. I leaned slightly closer to the lens. But pain is just a data point. It is a stark flashing signal telling you that a massive correction is immediately required. When everything you thought you knew burns completely to the ground, you are left with a fundamental life-altering choice. You can sit in the toxic ruins and mourn the illusion, or you can gather the ashes and forge something entirely indestructible. I chose to rebuild. I audited my entire life, ruthlessly cutting out the liabilities and investing heavily in my own resilience. I stopped waiting for someone else to save me and became the ruthless architect of my own salvation. So I leave you with this final critical question to answer for yourself. Who is currently managing the ledger of your life? Are you blindly trusting the people around you, or are you actively verifying their true intentions? When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to push you into the dark, will you stay on the floor and quietly accept your fate? Or will you gather your strength? Lock the doors from the inside and show them exactly what happens when you decide to audit the auditors. The board is set. Your assets are on the line. What is your next move? The chilling story of Nora's survival serves as a masterclass in one undeniable truth: blind trust is a luxury no one can truly afford. The most profound lesson embedded in her victory is the absolute necessity of maintaining financial independence and situational awareness even within the most intimate relationships. We are socially conditioned to believe that love requires the complete surrender of our autonomy, often leading us to hand over the keys to our financial and legal well-being to our partners. However, Nora's triumph was not born of luck or a last-minute miracle. It was the direct result of her relentless vigilance. She understood her own ledgers. She read the fine print of her life. When her husband attempted to weaponize her physical vulnerability, he discovered too late that she had already fortified her digital and financial borders. Her story teaches us that true security does not come from a marriage certificate or a shared bank account. It comes from retaining personal agency. You do not need to be a senior forensic auditor facing a life or death conspiracy to apply this wisdom. In our everyday lives, this lesson translates to basic self-preservation. It means staying actively involved in your household finances, understanding the legal documents you sign, and ensuring you always have a secure, independent safety net. Trusting your partner is a vital component of a relationship, but that trust should never require you to close your eyes and operate in the dark. Empowerment means owning your reality and refusing to become a passive passenger in your own life. Take a hard look at your own assets today, educate yourself on your financial standing, and ensure you always hold the keys to your own independence.